She stood in front of 1,000 people and laughed at him. Not a polite smile, not a dismissive wave, a full, open-mouthed laugh, the kind that bounces off warehouse walls and stays in a man's chest for years. Sophia Sterling, 30 years old, worth $4 billion, pointed at Ethan Ryder's cracked toolbox and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Is that what you brought? To impress me?" Ethan didn't flinch, didn't argue. He looked at the 6 rusted, dead motors behind her and thought one thing: I can work with this. Before we go any further, if this story speaks to you, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Tuesday morning Ethan Ryder decided to walk into Sterling Technologies began like every other morning of the past 14 months, with the sound of his daughter trying to make her own breakfast. He heard the cabinet open, the cereal box shuffle, the frustrated little grunt when she couldn't reach the bowls on the second shelf. He was already pulling on his jacket when he heard the chair scrape across the kitchen floor. She was dragging it from the table to use as a step stool, the same way she'd been doing since she figured out that trick at age 4. She was 7 now. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Mia." She froze, 1 foot on the chair, bowl already in hand, caught completely. Then she turned around and gave him the smile that had absolutely no business being that effective. Wide, bright, zero guilt. "I was going to clean up," she said. "I know you were." He crossed the kitchen, took the bowl from her hands, and got the cereal himself. "Sit down. I'll do it." "You're wearing your interview clothes." He glanced down at himself. The button-down shirt he'd ironed twice the night before because the collar kept curling, the dark slacks that were a little too short now because he'd lost weight in the wrong direction. Less from exercise, more from too many dinners where he'd told Mia he wasn't hungry so she could finish the food. The shoes were clean, at least. He'd spent 20 minutes on those. "They're just regular clothes," he said. Mia was watching him the way she sometimes watched things, with that quiet, too-old-for-her-age focus that made him feel like she was measuring something. "You ironed them twice." The collar was... "Dad." He stopped, set the cereal box down. "Yeah? You're going to do good today." He looked at her for a moment, 7 years old, brown eyes exactly like her mother's, sitting at a kitchen table in an apartment where the radiator only worked on one setting and the window in the living room had a crack taped over with weather stripping because the landlord kept saying he'd get to it. "Thanks, Bug," he said. He poured her cereal, made her a glass of juice from the last of the carton, left the remaining half glass for himself, and rinsed the carton before tossing it, old habit, the kind of thing you do when you've gotten careful about trash bags. While Mia ate, Ethan stood at the counter and went over what he knew about Sterling Technologies for what was probably the 20th time. Sophia Sterling, youngest daughter of Harold Sterling, who had built his first machine parts company at 22 and sold it for $40 million by the time he was 35. Sophia had not followed the same path. She had blown past it. She'd launched her own industrial technology division at 24, absorbed 3 competitors before she turned 28, and by 30 she controlled a company that supplied precision components to manufacturers across 11 countries. Her reputation in the industry was specific. She was brilliant, impatient, and allergic to wasted time. She was also, by multiple accounts, not particularly warm. Ethan had applied for a position in her mechanical engineering division. He had applied through the portal, then through the general contact form, then through a LinkedIn message that he'd rewritten 7 times. He had received 1 response, a calendar invite for a facility visit, no additional context, no job title attached to the meeting. He'd almost talked himself out of going. "What if it's just an information session?" he'd told his neighbor, Carl, the night before. Carl was 61 and retired and spent most evenings on his porch with a cup of decaf and opinions about everything. "Then you go to the information session," Carl had said. "What if she's not even there? What if it's just HR and some slide deck? Then you sit through HR and a slide deck and you network." "Ethan," Carl had looked at him over the rim of his mug, "you've been in that apartment for 14 months sending applications into the void. You got a response. Go." He went. Sterling Technologies occupied a facility on the eastern edge of the city's industrial corridor. A complex that had been expanded 3 times in 6 years, each addition larger and more modern than the last. The newest building had floor-to-ceiling glass along the front elevation, and the company's logo rendered in brushed steel above the entrance. It was the kind of building designed to make you feel, before you even walked in, that you were entering something significant. Ethan felt it. He also noticed, with the professional eye he'd spent 12 years developing, that the loading dock on the east side had drainage problems. He could see the water staining on the concrete pad from 20 feet away, and that one of the exterior HVAC units on the roof was running with a vibration pattern that suggested a bearing starting to fail. Some people looked at buildings and saw architecture. Ethan looked at buildings and heard what they needed. He checked in at the front desk. A young man in a company-branded fleece directed him to a conference space on the second floor where, as it turned out, there were 17 other people already seated. Some of them were in business casual. One man had brought a portfolio case. 2 women near the back were whispering to each other with the comfortable ease of people who already knew each other from somewhere else in the industry. Ethan found a seat in the 3rd row and set his toolbox on the floor beside his chair. It was not a portfolio case. It was a steel toolbox, gray, about the size of a carry-on bag, with a handle that had been re-welded once and a latch that required knowing the exact angle to push. He'd had it for 9 years. His late wife, Carla, had given it to him on their 2nd anniversary because she'd said his old one was embarrassing, and then she'd laughed when she'd seen how seriously he'd taken that. He'd kept it clean, kept the tools organized, replaced what wore out. It was scratched and worn in the way that working tools get worn. Not from neglect, but from use. He noticed a few people looking at it. He didn't say anything. 20 minutes after the scheduled start time, Sophia Sterling walked in. She wasn't what he'd expected, and he recognized immediately that he'd been forming expectations based on nothing, press photos mostly, and one interview clip he'd watched online where she'd answered 3 questions in under 2 minutes before thanking the interviewer with the kind of efficiency that made it clear she was done. In person, she was shorter than he'd imagined and moved faster, already talking to someone on her phone as she crossed the room, jacket still half on, 2 members of her team trailing her with tablets and a coffee she didn't look at. She ended the call, accepted the coffee without looking at that either, and surveyed the room. "All right." Her voice was clear and carried without effort. "I'll be honest with you. I didn't write the email that brought you here, and I didn't vet the list of attendees. My team handles recruitment, and I trust them to do that. But I do these facility visits myself because I want to see who shows up in person, which tells me more than any resume." She paused. Someone near the front shifted in their chair. "Most of you are here about the mechanical engineering openings," she continued. "A few of you are here about operations. One of you," she looked at a man in the 2nd row who sat up straighter, "put general inquiry on the form, so I'm not entirely sure why you're here, but we'll figure that out." A small ripple of polite laughter. The man in the 2nd row looked like he wanted to dissolve. Sophia's eyes moved through the room and stopped, briefly, on Ethan. Or more specifically, on the toolbox beside his chair. "We're going to take a quick tour of the facility," she said, returning to the room at large. "I'll answer questions as we go. After that, my team will schedule individual follow-ups with anyone we're interested in pursuing. If you don't hear from us, please don't take it personally. We're very specific about what we're looking for." The tour moved through the main production floor, then through the Precision Components lab, then through a section that Ethan understood immediately was the crown jewel of the operation. The testing environment, climate-controlled, with equipment that he recognized and equipment that he didn't, which was not a common experience for him. He asked 2 questions, one about the tolerance ranges they were working with on a particular class of bearing assembly, one about whether they were running continuous or batch processing on the high-volume lines. Both were answered efficiently by one of the trailing team members. Sophia glanced at him once during the 2nd answer. Then they came to the back of the facility. It was a storage area technically, a long, low-ceilinged space that ran along the rear of the original building, the part that predated all the expansions. And in that space, pushed against the far wall under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, sat 6 industrial motors. They were not small. Each one was roughly the size of a washing machine, mounted on steel bases with connection points and housing that suggested serious prior application. And every single one of them was in bad shape. Not just old, Failed. Seized. Corroded in the particular way that happens when metal is exposed to moisture over years, not days. The kind of rust that goes into the surface, not just onto it. One of the team members, a young woman with a clipboard, glanced at them as the group passed. "Those are getting scrapped next month," she said to no one in particular. "They were supposed to get scrapped 3 months ago," said someone else. Ethan had slowed without realizing it. He was standing at the edge of the group, looking at the motors with the focused stillness he got sometimes when something caught his attention in a particular way. He could see, under the corrosion, the housing geometry. He could read the nameplate on the nearest one despite the rust, old enough that the design was a generation he recognized. He was running calculations in his head, not consciously, just the way his mind worked. "Something interesting back there?" He looked up. Sophia Sterling was watching him from 8 feet away. The rest of the group had continued moving. He was the only one who'd stopped. "The motors," he said. She didn't look at them. She was looking at him. "You recognize them?" The housing is a third-generation radial series. Early 2000s, probably 2003 or 2004 based on the mounting configuration. They'd have been commercial grade when they were new. Decent torque range, nothing exotic. He paused. "What happened to them?" "Moisture infiltration in the storage facility they came from. Previous acquisition. We inherited them with the building, couldn't integrate them into our current systems, and nobody's found a reason to do anything with them except move them from one storage area to another for the last 2 years. She finally glanced at the motors. "They're junk." "They might not be." Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, more like the specific attention of someone who has been told something they didn't expect. "Excuse me?" "I can't say for certain without getting into them, but the housing on that first one looks intact. If the windings aren't completely gone and the shaft isn't seized all the way through, it might be salvageable. Not as is, obviously, but we have engineers," she said. "Actual engineers with the degrees and testing equipment. They looked at those motors. They said scrap." He didn't argue with that. He just said, "What's in the toolbox?" She blinked. "What?" He held it up slightly. "My toolbox. You looked at it when we were in the conference room. I saw you." For a moment, she just regarded him. Then she said, "I was wondering why someone brought a toolbox to a facility tour." "Because I'm a mechanic," he said. "That's what I do. I look at machines and I figure out what they need. That's the skill I'm here to offer." She studied him for a moment. The 2 short slacks, the ironed collar, the 9-year-old toolbox with the re-welded handle. "How long have you been out of work?" she asked. It was a direct question, the kind designed to land somewhere, and it did. He felt it, but he kept his face steady. 14 months? "What happened to your last position?" "The facility shut down. They sold the equipment and laid off the whole mechanical division in one afternoon. I was senior tech." "And before that?" 12 years at Hartwell Manufacturing. Started on the floor, worked up to lead maintenance tech, finished as division supervisor." Sophia nodded slowly. "Hartwell. I know Hartwell." Another pause. "They're not known for investing in young talent." "They weren't young when they promoted me," he said. Something crossed her face that might, in a different context, have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't become one. She turned to her team. "Let's move on." "What?" The individual follow-up session, as it turned out, was not individual. It was a group Q&A in the conference room, led not by Sophia, but by a woman named Patricia, who was the director of talent acquisition. Patricia was efficient and professional, and answered questions with the practiced fluency of someone who did this regularly. Ethan sat through it, asked one question, wrote down the contact information on the card Patricia handed out at the end. He was almost at the door when a voice behind him said his name. He turned. Sophia Sterling was standing at the back of the room, coffee cup in hand, 2 team members hovering at a respectful distance. Everyone else had already filed out. "The motors," she said. "Yes?" "You said they might not be junk." She said it with a kind of careful neutrality that he couldn't quite read. "What exactly did you mean by that?" He considered his answer, not the careful job interview version of the answer, the actual answer. I meant that when I looked at them, I didn't see the same thing your engineers saw. I can't prove that without getting my hands on them, but I think there's something there. And if you're wrong? Then I'm wrong, and they go to scrap like they were going to anyway. Nothing changes. She looked at him for a long moment. The two team members behind her exchanged a glance. You have the contact information, she said finally. We'll be in touch. They were not in touch. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Ethan sent one follow-up email, professional and brief, and received an automated acknowledgement. He filled out 2 more applications at other companies and heard nothing. He did 3 days of contract work for a warehouse facility on the south side, a plumbing system inspection job that paid less than he wanted and more than he had. He replaced the tape on the living room window with actual weather stripping he'd found on clearance and spent a Saturday afternoon on his knees in the draft, fixing what the landlord kept promising to fix. Mia helped by holding the flashlight. She was remarkably good at holding flashlights. Do you think they'll call? She asked on a Thursday evening when he was going through emails at the kitchen table and she was supposed to be doing homework. He looked up. Who? The big company, the glass one. She'd seen the building from the car when he'd pointed it out. She'd been impressed by the glass. I don't know, he said, which was true. But do you think they should call? He put the laptop down and looked at her. What do you mean? She was quiet for a second in the way she got when she was working something out. I mean, do you think you were good enough? Like, not whether they'll call, but whether you should have called them. He opened his mouth and then closed it. That's a complicated question, Bug. Is it? He thought about it, about the motors, about standing in that back storage room with the buzzing fluorescent lights and looking at 6 machines that the most well-equipped engineering team in the city had called worthless and seeing something different. No, he said, it's not that complicated. Yeah, I think I should have called. So call them. Mia, Dad. She said it with the particular gravity of a 7-year-old who has arrived at a conclusion and is waiting for the adults to catch up. You always say that things don't get fixed by looking at them. He stared at her. You say that all the time, she added helpfully. When I broke the bike, when the sink thing happened, you say you have to actually… Get in there, he finished. Yeah. He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called the number on Patricia's card. It went to voicemail. He left a message that was careful and professional and mentioned, at the end, that he'd like to take another look at those motors if the offer was still open. He got a call back the next morning. Not from Patricia. From Sophia Sterling. Washington. She didn't say hello when he picked up. She said, How long would you need with the motors? He blinked. To assess them? To do whatever it is you think needs to be done with them. In your estimation. He had not been expecting this. He thought quickly. For a real assessment, a day. Maybe 2. If the first one tells me what I think it might, I'd want to go through all 6. And you'd need what? Tools? Access? My toolbox and a power connection, and something to take notes on. A brief pause. That's it? That's it. Another pause, longer this time. I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Ryder. I'm not offering you a job. I'm offering you a problem to look at. If you find something my team missed, we'll talk about what that means. If you don't, you've spent a couple of days in a storage room and gotten nothing out of it. I understand. You're comfortable with that arrangement? He looked at the kitchen, at the cleared-away breakfast things, at the empty juice carton he'd rinsed and thrown away, at the crack in the ceiling above the window that had been there since they moved in. Yes, he said, I'm comfortable with that. He went in on a Monday. They gave him a badge that said contractor and access to the back storage area and a folding table that one of the facilities staff brought in without being asked, which he appreciated. The fluorescent lights still buzzed. The 6 motors still sat against the wall like monuments to something that had stopped working. Ethan put his toolbox down, opened the latch at the exact angle it needed, and got to work. The first motor took 4 hours just to open properly. The corrosion had welded the housing screws into positions that required patient, methodical work with penetrating oil and the right amount of force applied in exactly the right way. Going too fast would strip them. Going wrong would snap them. He went slowly. Inside the housing, he found what he'd half expected and half hoped. The windings were damaged but not destroyed. The shaft had surface corrosion but had not seized completely at the core. The bearing seats were corroded, replaceable. The damage was extensive, but it was also, importantly, surface. The corrosion had attacked the outside of the machine with real aggression, but the essential structures, the parts that made the thing a motor rather than a large paperweight, had been protected enough by the housing geometry that they were still, technically, there. He photographed everything, made detailed notes, did the same for the second motor while the first was soaking in penetrating oil in sections. Found broadly similar conditions. By the end of day 2, he had a thorough picture of all 6 machines. None of them could be restored to original spec. That was real. The corrosion had been too thorough, the time too long. Anyone who'd told Sophia's engineering team to scrap them hadn't been wrong about the restoration question. But restoration wasn't the only question. He'd been thinking, between the careful work of opening housing screws and cleaning contact points, about something different, about what these motors were, their core mechanical principle, the design logic underneath the corrosion, and about 3 or 4 other problems he'd encountered over his career where he'd had to think sideways instead of straight. One job at Hartwell, where a machine had been replaced because it couldn't meet spec, and he'd realized the spec had been written for the wrong application. One contract job where equipment had been declared unusable, and he'd spent a week rebuilding it into something that did a completely different task better than the original. He wasn't thinking about making these motors into what they'd been. He was thinking about what they could become. He called Sophia's direct line on day 3. She picked up on the second ring. "I finished the assessment," he said. "And?" "They can't be restored to original spec. Your team was right about that. The corrosion is too far in on the electrical components, and the tolerances for the original application won't hold." A silence. "So they were right. They're junk." "For what they were, yes." He paused, choosing words carefully. "But I don't think that's the right question to be asking about them." "Then what's the right question?" "What could they become," he said, "if you stopped trying to make them what they were?" Another silence, longer this time. "You'd better come explain that in person," she said. He presented his initial findings in a conference room that was considerably nicer than the one he'd sat in for the facility tour. Sophia sat across from him with 2 engineers on either side of her. Men who were probably 28 or 29, sharp-looking, with the particular posture of people who were good at their jobs and knew it. They had their tablets open. They looked at Ethan's notes and photographs with the professional neutrality of people preparing to be politely skeptical. He walked them through the assessment first, agreed with their conclusions on restoration, made clear he was not here to argue that they'd made a mistake. Then he moved to the second part. He showed them drawings. Not finished blueprints. He'd made these by hand in his apartment the night before. The kind of rough technical sketches that communicated ideas rather than measurements. He talked through the core concept. If you stripped the motors down further than restoration required, if you treated the surviving structural and mechanical components as raw material rather than a baseline to recover, if you combined elements from multiple units and rebuilt around a different application profile, one of the engineers interrupted. "You're talking about using them as donor parts for a new design." "More than that," Ethan said. "I'm talking about a design that wouldn't exist without the specific constraints these motors impose. The housing geometry, the shaft diameter, the existing bearing seats. They're not flaws to design around. They're parameters to design from." Silence. The second engineer leaned forward. "What application are you thinking?" Ethan told them. What followed was 45 minutes of the most focused technical conversation he'd had in 14 months. The engineers asked hard questions and he answered them, sometimes directly, sometimes with, "I don't know yet, that's the next thing to figure out," which he'd learned over 12 years was a more useful answer than a wrong one. They pushed on the structural assumptions. They questioned the component compatibility. They raised 3 problems he hadn't thought of, and he raised 2 that they hadn't either. Sophia said almost nothing for the entire 45 minutes. She sat at the head of the table with her coffee and watched. When it was over, one of the engineers, the one who'd asked about donor parts, leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. "I mean," he said, to no one in particular, "it's not impossible." "It's also not what I'd have thought of," said the other one, which was, Ethan understood, a significant thing for someone in that position to say out loud. Sophia looked at Ethan. "What do you need to take this further?" He had thought about this. "A workspace, basic equipment. Some components I can source myself if I have a budget to work with, and access to those motors." "How long?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "A few months, minimum. If the first rebuild confirms the concept, probably longer." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not offering you a position." "I know. I'm offering you a contract, project-based. You develop the concept to the point where my team can evaluate it properly. If it holds up, we talk about next steps. If it doesn't, the contract ends." "What does the contract pay?" She named a number. It was not what a senior engineering position would pay. It was enough. "I'll need it in writing by Friday," he said. "You'll have it by Thursday," she said. He didn't tell Mia about the contract when he got home. He made dinner, pasta, because it was a pasta budget week, and helped her with the worksheet she'd been struggling with, and listened to the stories she'd been building in her head about a group of explorers who discovered a city inside a mountain. He made interested noises in the right places. He washed the dishes. After she went to bed, he stood in the kitchen for a long time. He was thinking about the motors, about the design in his head that he'd been turning over since the storage room, the one that wasn't quite finished yet, that had gaps and assumptions and 3 open questions he couldn't answer without getting his hands back on the machines. He was thinking about the workspace he didn't have yet, and the tools he'd need to source, and the fact that the contract paid enough to cover basics, but not enough to cover mistakes. He was also thinking about Carla, not in a grief spiral way. He'd learned, over 2.5 years, the difference between the kind of thinking about her that helped and the kind that didn't. This was the other kind, the simple, specific, practical memory of sitting with her at this same kitchen table the night before a different risk, a different opportunity that had looked thin from the outside, and her asking him, "What's your worst-case scenario?" He'd told her. She'd said, "Okay, can you survive the worst case?" He thought about it now. The honest version. The contract ended. The concept didn't hold up. He'd spent months on something that came to nothing. Could he survive it? Yes. It would hurt. But yes. She'd always followed that with, "Then go." He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The contract arrived Thursday morning, as promised. He read it 3 times, made 2 notes in the margin, and signed it. That afternoon, he rented a garage space on Clement Street from a man named Dale, who asked 0 questions about what Ethan planned to do in there, and charged a flat monthly rate that didn't include heat, but did include a 220-volt outlet, which was the important part. He moved his toolbox in that evening, stood in the empty space with the roll-up door closed and the bare bulb overhead, and looked at the concrete floor. 6 dead motors. 1 man, 1 cracked toolbox. He had absolutely no idea if this was going to work. He opened the latch at the exact angle it required and got to work. The first week in the garage on Clement Street taught Ethan 3 things. The first was that Dale, the landlord who asked 0 questions, also provided 0 heat, and that the temperature in an uninsulated concrete space in November dropped to something that made precision work with bare hands genuinely difficult after about 9 in the evening. The second was that the 220-volt outlet, while present, had wiring that someone had modified at some point in a way that was not exactly to code, which he spent most of Thursday afternoon tracing before he felt comfortable running anything important off it. The third was that working alone, without a team, without the background noise of a functioning facility, was a different kind of work than he'd done in 12 years at Hartwell. Quieter, more internal, and harder to step away from because there was no shift change to force the question. He'd built a rough schedule in his head during the drive to the garage each morning. He dropped Mia at school at 7:50, which meant he was at the garage by 8:15 if he hit the lights right, and 8:30 if he didn't. He had until 3:30 when he had to leave to pick her up. That was 6.5 hours on a good day, 5.5 on a bad one. Evenings, after dinner and homework, and the gradual process of getting Mia to actually stop talking and go to sleep He had the kitchen table and his notebook and whatever his brain had left. It was not a lot of hours for the scale of what he was attempting. Sterling Technologies had transported all 6 motors to the garage at the start of the second week, delivered on a flatbed by 2 men who placed them with a forklift and left without saying much. Ethan had spent an hour after they left just standing in the middle of the space looking at the arrangement. 6 motors in a single-car garage made it feel considerably smaller than it was. He had to think carefully about workflow, which ones to work on in what order, how to create enough clear space to move around them without turning every task into an obstacle course. He started with motor 3, not 1, which had been his initial assessment focus. He'd thought about it overnight and concluded that 1 was in the best overall condition, which made it the most valuable and also the one he could least afford to get wrong first. 3 was in worse shape, but had the specific internal geometry he needed to test the concept's most uncertain assumption. If 3 didn't validate the theory, the sequence of the other 5 didn't matter. He pulled the housing completely in the first session, cleaned what could be cleaned, began the careful, destructive work of separating what was salvageable from what wasn't. A process that felt uncomfortably like surgery, the kind where you were making permanent decisions about what stayed and what went. By the end of the second week, he had a clear accounting of what 6 motors actually yielded in usable components when you stopped trying to keep them whole. More than he'd expected, less than he'd hoped, and a very specific gap in the middle where a key component would have to come from somewhere else entirely. That was when the money problem became concrete. The contract payment came in installments. First payment at signing, second at the 30-day mark, third contingent on milestone delivery. The first payment had covered rent on the garage and some basic supplies, and that was approximately where it ended. He had a list of components he needed to source, and a budget that covered maybe 60% of it, which in practical terms meant he had to be creative about the other 40. He started making calls, old contacts from Hartwell, people he'd worked alongside who'd scattered to other facilities when the plant shut down. A machinist named Howard, who was now at a small shop in the suburbs and owed Ethan a favor from a situation involving a seized press machine and a deadline that Howard's team could not have met without help. A salvage operation run by a woman named Bess who dealt in industrial components and who Ethan had bought from twice before and who, crucially, would hold items for a week before selling them if you called and asked nicely. "What are you building?" Bess asked when he called, because she always asked. "Something new," he said, "out of something old." That's either very poetic or very impractical. Might be both. "What do you need?" He read her the list. She was quiet for a moment, and he could hear the sound of her walking through the yard, boots on gravel. "I've got 4 of those. The bearing assembly? No. The drive coupling? Maybe. I'd have to look. The rest? Yes." "What's your price on the 4 you have?" She told him. He did the math against what he had left. "I can do 3 of them now and the 4th in 3 weeks when my next installment comes in." "Which 3? "The 2 shaft components and the housing bracket." Another pause, more gravel. "Fine, but I'm not holding the coupling past the end of the month." "Understood. Thank you, Bess." "Don't thank me, just pay on time." He drove out to her yard on a Saturday with Mia in the passenger seat because he had no other option, and Mia spent the hour that the transaction took walking carefully between rows of industrial equipment with her arms folded to her chest, not touching anything, looking at everything with enormous eyes. On the drive home, she said, "It's like a graveyard, but for machines." "Sort of," Ethan said. "Do they get sad when they're not being used anymore?" He thought about that for a moment, about the 6 motors in the garage, about what they'd been and what they might become. "I don't think machines get sad," he said, "but I think they have a kind of potential, like the ability to do something is still there even when it's not being used, and maybe it's a waste when that potential doesn't get a chance." Mia considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Like how I'm really good at drawing, but my teacher mostly just does math worksheets. Exactly like that. She seemed satisfied. She looked out the window. Then, "Are you going to save them? The machines?" "I'm going to try." "Good," she said in the tone of someone closing a matter. The problem that he had not fully articulated to Sophia, because he hadn't fully articulated it to himself yet at the point of signing the contract, was that what he was attempting was not really a restoration or even a redesign in the conventional sense. It was closer to a proof of concept for a different way of thinking about industrial motor failure. The idea that a failed motor was not a discrete broken object, but a collection of components at different stages of their usable life, and that the conventional response of replacing the whole unit was leaving significant value on the table. The application he'd described in the conference room was real, but it was also a container for the larger idea. If he could demonstrate that these 6 specific motors, written off as junk by a professional engineering team, could be rebuilt into a functional system using their own surviving components plus a targeted set of sourced parts, then the question became, what else was being thrown away that didn't have to be? He knew that was a bigger argument than his current contract called for. He also knew he couldn't quite stop thinking about it. He started keeping a second notebook alongside the technical one. Not drawings, words, observations. The specific things he noticed while working that suggested the concept had implications beyond the immediate project. He wrote in it late at night, at the kitchen table, in the 10 or 15 minutes before exhaustion made the sentences stop making sense. It was not organized. It was not intended for anyone else. It was just the overflow from a mind that had spent 12 years at Hartwell solving one problem at a time, and was now, for the first time, working on something that might be more than one problem. He didn't tell Sophia about the second notebook. The 30-day mark came. He submitted his milestone documentation, photographs, technical specifications, component accounting, a written assessment of where the project stood. His assessment was honest. The concept was holding up, but the timeline was longer than he'd initially projected, and he'd identified a fabrication requirement that was going to need either equipment he didn't have or a machinist with access to a lathe capable of working to the tolerances he needed. Howard, when asked, said yes, but it would take 2 weeks and it wasn't going to be cheap. Ethan said okay. The second installment arrived and he paid Howard a deposit. He had enough left for the garage rent and groceries and not much else. He looked at the numbers at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night, adding them 3 different ways to see if any version came out better. It didn't. He called his brother-in-law, Marcus, Carla's younger brother, who lived across town and who Ethan had maintained a relationship with because Marcus was genuinely good with Mia and because Carla would have wanted him to, and asked if Marcus could take Mia for the weekend of the 12th because Ethan needed the full Saturday to work and couldn't cover after-school pickup on Friday. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked. "Yeah, just a crunch on this project." "You need money?" "No." He paused. "Not yet." Marcus was quiet for a second. "Ethan?" "I'm fine, Marcus." "I didn't say you weren't. I'm asking." He looked at the numbers on the paper in front of him. "I have enough to get to the next milestone payment. If everything goes on schedule." "And if it doesn't?" He didn't answer that one. Marcus came on Friday and took Mia to his place, and Mia went happily because Marcus had a dog named Bucket and a television that got more channels than their apartment and made popcorn without complaint on Friday nights. She hugged Ethan at the door with the particular tight squeeze that meant she'd noticed something was up and wasn't going to say so. "Work hard, Dad," she said. "I will, Bug." "Call me before I go to bed." "Always do." He worked 12 hours the following Saturday, made more progress than he'd made in the entire preceding week. There was something about uninterrupted time, the way it allowed him to hold the full complexity of a problem in his head without having to put it down and pick it back up. At Hartwell, even in senior roles, he'd always been managing interruptions, someone else's crisis, someone else's deadline. He'd been good at it, but the truth was he'd always known his best thinking happened in the spaces in between. Now there were only the spaces in between. Late that afternoon, working on Motor 5, he found the thing he'd been hoping wasn't there. A crack in the main housing, not on the surface, which he'd have seen during initial assessment, but inside, running through a load-bearing section in a way that didn't show until he had the unit properly disassembled. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. The crack changed his math. Not catastrophically. The housing wasn't load-bearing in the rebuilt application the way it had been in the original design, but it changed the component accounting, and it meant rethinking how 5 integrated with the others, which meant revising specifications he'd already sent Howard. He called Howard's shop, got voicemail, left a message explaining the revision and the reason, careful and specific, because Howard needed the correct information, and Ethan had learned a long time ago that the cost of being vague on a spec was always higher than the cost of being thorough. Then he sat in the garage on the concrete floor with his back against Motor 5's base and thought about how many more things he hadn't found yet. This was the part of a project that nobody who hadn't done it could really understand. The moment when you were deep enough in that you could see all the ways it could fail, and you weren't deep enough to see all the ways it wouldn't. It was the least comfortable place to be. Not the beginning, which had energy, not the end, which had resolution. The middle, where everything was uncertainty and the original confidence that had gotten you started felt thin and possibly naive. He called Mia at 8, as promised. "How's Bucket?" he asked. "Chaotic," she said, which was a word she'd picked up from somewhere and now used regularly. "He stole Marcus's sock right off his foot while he was sitting down. Just grabbed it. Marcus was so mad." Was Marcus actually mad, or was he doing the fake mad thing? She giggled. The fake mad thing. He kept the sock in the air, but the whole time he was laughing. He talked to her for 20 minutes about Bucket and the popcorn and the movie Marcus had put on that she'd seen before, but didn't mind watching again. He sat on the concrete floor of the garage the whole time, back against the base of a motor that had just shown him a crack it had been hiding, and listened to his daughter laugh about a dog stealing a sock, and felt the particular calibration of good and hard that had become the texture of his life. "Dad," she said toward the end. "Yeah? Is the project going okay?" He looked at Motor 5, at the crack he'd found, at the 5 other machines around him in various states of disassembly, and the notes on the folding table, and the second notebook that was filling up slower than the first. "It's going," he said. "Is that yes or no?" "It's honest," he said. A pause. Then, "Okay, that's okay." He didn't know why that hit him as hard as it did. He didn't analyze it. He just said goodnight and sat for another few minutes in the cold garage before getting up, closing the toolbox, and driving home. The machined parts from Howard arrived in week 7. They were exactly right. Howard was precise in the way of someone who took professional pride seriously. And when Ethan began fitting them into the assembly he'd been working toward, something happened that didn't always happen in technical work and couldn't be forced when it didn't. The pieces began to resolve into something that made sense not just on paper, but in 3 dimensions, in his hands, in the physical reality of metal and tolerances and fit. He worked through lunch. He forgot he'd been planning to stop at 2 to buy groceries. He remembered at 4:15 when his phone buzzed with an alarm he'd set 3 weeks earlier for a different reason entirely, and he looked up from what he was doing and realized 4 hours had passed without his noticing. The first rebuilt assembly wasn't complete, but it was beginning to be visible in the material, the way a thing you're building transitions from abstract to real. Not at the end, but at the moment when you can see the end from where you are. He stood and stretched and felt every hour of the past 7 weeks in his lower back and both knees. He took photographs, updated his technical notes, stood back and looked at the assembly from 4 different angles the way he always did, because sometimes the angle you'd been working at hit a problem that the angle you hadn't been at would show. No new problems. Not today. He locked the garage, got in the car, and went to buy groceries 45 minutes before the store closed, moving through the aisles with the particular efficiency of a man who is tired and has a list and is not browsing. At the pasta shelf, he ran into a woman named Grace, who was Mia's teacher, who recognized him first and said his name before he'd processed who she was. He had a brief, slightly embarrassing moment of face recognition lag before it resolved. "Mr. Ryder," she said, "how are you? Mia's been so focused lately. She did a wonderful piece for our creative writing unit, a story about engineers who discover a city inside a mountain." He stopped. "She wrote that down." 4 pages. She read it to the class. Grace had the warm, specific energy of someone who genuinely liked her job. She said her dad inspired it, that he was an engineer who looked at broken things and saw what they could become. He stood in the pasta aisle for a moment with a bag of penne in his hand and didn't say anything. "I hope that's all right to share," Grace said, reading his expression wrong. She seemed proud. "It's fine," he said. Yeah. Thank you." He drove home thinking about that. about a 7-year-old who had been paying close enough attention to what her father did every day to write 4 pages about it, about the specific phrase Grace had used, looked at broken things and saw what they could become. He didn't know if that was Mia's language or the teacher paraphrasing, but either way, it was accurate in a way that was slightly uncomfortable, because it meant that what he was doing was visible to her. Not just the going to the garage and coming home tired part, but the actual thinking underneath it. Kids notice more than you managed them knowing. He'd understood that abstractly. He understood it more concretely now. He cooked dinner, helped with homework, said nothing about the teacher or the story. After Mia went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the second notebook and wrote for an hour, which was longer than usual, and when he stopped and read back what he'd written, he saw that his thinking had shifted. Not in the technical specifications, those lived in the first notebook, but in the framework around them, the larger argument about what the project meant. The notes had gotten both more specific and more ambitious in a way he hadn't consciously decided to go. He read it again. Then he closed the notebook and put it face down on the table as if it had said something forward. Week 9 brought a complication that was not technical. He got a call from the property management company that handled the apartment, not his landlord, who he'd been dealing with directly for 3 years, but a management company which was new and which meant something he already suspected before the woman on the phone confirmed it. The building had been sold. New ownership, new lease terms as of 90 days out. The new rent was $340 per month higher than his current rate. He did the math on the call without letting the woman on the phone hear him do it. With the contract installments and what he had in savings, which was not much, he could cover it for, he finished calculating, 2 months. 3 if he was very careful about everything else. The contract's final payment was contingent on milestone delivery, which was not yet certain, and there was nothing in the agreement about the timeline for the follow-up conversation Sophia had mentioned. He did not know what that conversation would yield or when it would happen. He thanked the management company representative and ended the call and sat for a moment in the garage, surrounded by motors in various states of being rebuilt, and did the thing he tried not to do, mapped out the sequence of consequences if the contract didn't resolve the way he needed it to. Then he stopped, because he'd found it wasn't a useful exercise. The variable he could control was the work. Everything else was downstream of that. He picked up his wrench and went back to motor 2. The crisis, when it came, was small and specific and happened on a Wednesday. A fitting that he'd sourced through Bess had been listed as a certain specification and turned out, when he went to install it, to be close but not exactly right. A tolerance difference that would have been acceptable in some applications and was not acceptable in this one. He could have forced it. He'd worked with people who would have forced it. He didn't force it. He pulled it, drove back out to Bess's yard, and stood at the counter explaining the discrepancy to the young man behind it, who had not been there when Ethan originally purchased the part, and who did not know immediately how to handle the situation. Bess appeared from the back after 7 minutes. She looked at the fitting. She looked at Ethan. "I listed it as 0.4, she said. "I know. It's 0.38. She examined it, turned it over. "That should not have been listed as 0.4. "It shouldn't." She looked at him steadily. "I'll replace it at no charge." "I appreciate that. I'll have the correct one by Friday." "That's fine." She started to turn back toward the shelves, then stopped. "How's it going? The project?" "Slowly," he said. "But actually going." She nodded. "What are you really building?" He'd been asked this a few times now, in different ways. By Bess, by Howard, by Carl on the porch one evening. He'd given different partial answers depending on context. Standing in the salvage yard at 4 in the afternoon, with a misspecified fitting in his hand, he gave Bess the closest thing to the real answer. "A different way of thinking about failure," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "For machines." "To start with." She looked at him for another second, then, "Friday. I'll call you when it comes in." The correct fitting arrived Thursday. Bess called him as promised, and he drove out the same day because he could not afford to lose another workday to the gap it left in the assembly. He installed it that evening, after dinner, after Mia was in bed, which meant working in a garage that had dropped to a temperature he would charitably describe as rigorous. And it fit. Not sort of fit. Not fit with adjustment. Fit. He sat back and looked at the assembly and let himself, for about 30 seconds, feel good about it. Then he moved on, because there was still a great deal of motor 2 left to deal with. Week 10 was when the design started to become something he hadn't expected. He'd gone into the project with a clear concept, what he'd presented to Sophia and her engineers, the specific application, the component strategy. He'd been pursuing that concept methodically, refining it as the actual material taught him things the drawings hadn't. But somewhere around the middle of week 10, working on the integration between motors 3 and 4, which were going to function as a paired unit in the final system, he ran into a configuration problem that forced him to rethink the connection architecture. He spent 2 days on it, drew and redrew, tried 3 different approaches on paper, rejected 2 of them, sat with the third one for a long evening at the kitchen table while the building settled around him and the heat came on in the one register that actually worked. The third approach worked. It also, as he followed it out on the page, produced a secondary effect he had not intended, and which was, there was not a better word for it, better than what he'd originally designed. The configuration he'd stumbled into through problem solving was more efficient, more compact, and introduced an adaptive element that the original design hadn't had. He stared at the drawings for a long time. Then he started over. Not over from the beginning, over from the point where the new configuration diverged from the old one, which was week 7's work, which meant 3 weeks of progress needed to be reevaluated against the new approach. He went through everything with the systematic rigor of someone who had learned, over 12 years, that checking your own assumptions was the job that most people skipped and most problems came from. 2 days of checking. Some of what he'd done held up fine. Some of it needed adjustment. One section needed to be taken apart and redone, which cost him a full day. It was worth it. By the end of week 11, the first rebuilt unit was complete. Not the full system, that was still weeks away, but the first motor, rebuilt and reconfigured and integrated with sourced components into the initial proof of the concept. He ran a bench test with the equipment he had available, which was not the equipment he'd ideally use for a proper evaluation, but was sufficient for a first reading. The numbers were better than his calculations had projected. Not dramatically, but measurably. The efficiency improvement was real. The adaptive element functioned the way he'd hoped it would when he'd redesigned around it. He photographed everything, wrote up a preliminary summary, and then sat in the garage for a few minutes doing nothing, which was unusual for him. He was tired in a way that had layered up over 11 weeks until it was structural, not just the tiredness of a hard day, but the tiredness of a hard season. His hands were marked up in the specific way of sustained hands-on work, knuckle scrapes that had healed and reopened and healed again, a burn scar from a week 3 incident with a heat gun that had become a permanent part of his right forearm. He'd lost some weight that he hadn't been carrying extra, which meant he'd lost some weight he hadn't meant to. He thought about Mia's story. 4 pages about engineers who looked at broken things. He thought about the second notebook on the kitchen table, the framework accumulating in the margins of the technical work. He pulled out his phone and called Sophia Sterling's direct line. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Ryder? First unit is complete," he said. "Bench test numbers are attached to the email I just sent." A pause. He heard something in the background. Voices. The particular ambient sound of a large office floor. "I'll look at them tonight." "There's something else?" he said. "What?" He thought about how to say it, about the redesign he'd arrived at through problem solving, about the second notebook, about a 7-year-old who'd written 4 pages about looking at broken things and seeing what they could become. "The design changed during the build," he said. "It's better than what I presented you in the conference room. Not incrementally better. Actually different in a way that matters. I need to walk you through it in person." Silence for a moment. "How different?" she asked. "Different enough that I don't want to describe it on the phone." Another pause. Longer. He could hear her thinking, or maybe he was imagining it. "Monday morning," she said. 9 o'clock. Bring everything." "I'll be there." He put the phone in his pocket and looked around the garage, at the 5 motors still in various states, at the folding table covered in notes, at the first completed unit sitting in the corner under a work light. He was cold and tired, and behind on sleep in a way that would take a week of normal nights to fix, and his back hurt in 2 specific places that he was developing real familiarity with. He locked up and drove home to make dinner. The work wasn't done. It was nowhere near done, but it was going. That was enough for tonight. That was exactly enough. The Monday morning meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and Ethan arrived at 8:43 because he was the kind of person who arrived early to things that mattered, and then sat in the parking lot rechecking his materials until it was an acceptable time to go in. He had everything. The technical documentation, printed and organized in a binder he'd bought specifically for this because loose papers in a folder felt wrong for what he was presenting. The bench test data. The photographs. A full sequence from initial disassembly through the completed rebuild, organized chronologically so you could see the transformation without anyone having to take his word for it. The revised drawings, which he'd spent the better part of Sunday redoing cleanly after 11 weeks of working drawings that had corrections and margin notes, and one section where he'd run out of space and continued on the back. He also brought the second notebook, which he almost left in the car, and then didn't. The reception desk logged him in at 8:58. The same young man in the branded fleece from his first visit was working the front desk, and either didn't remember Ethan or was professionally neutral about it. Ethan got a visitor badge and waited near the elevator. Patricia, the talent acquisition director, appeared to escort him up. She was pleasant and brisk and made small talk about the weather in the elevator, with the ease of someone who made small talk in elevators many times a day. Ethan responded appropriately and thought about his opening. He'd rehearsed it, not out loud. He wasn't someone who talked to himself in preparation, but internally, the sequence of what he was going to say and in what order, the way he used to do before a performance review or a difficult conversation with a floor supervisor. The sequence mattered. You could have all the right information and lose the room by putting it in the wrong order. The conference room was not the same one as before. This one was smaller, which he took as a signal of something, either that there would be fewer people or that the meeting was being treated differently, or both. When Patricia opened the door and he walked in, he found out it was both. Sophia was there. One of the two engineers from the previous meeting, the one who'd said it's not impossible, was there. A third person he didn't recognize, older, with reading glasses on top of his head, and a yellow legal pad on the table in front of him. That was it. 3 people. "Sit down," Sophia said, not unpleasantly. She was looking at the binder he was carrying. He sat. Put the binder on the table, but didn't open it yet. "This is Marcus Webb," Sophia said, indicating the man with the legal pad. "He's our head of research and development. And you remember Daniel." She nodded toward the engineer. Daniel gave Ethan a nod that was professional and carried something that might have been curiosity. Marcus Webb was already looking at the binder. "You said the design changed," Sophia said. "That's where I want to start." Ethan opened the binder to the revised drawings. He'd tabbed the key sections with small colored markers because he'd learned that when you were walking someone through technical material, the physical act of finding the right page created dead air that let people's attention drift. He didn't want anyone's attention drifting. "When I presented the initial concept," he said, "the design assumed a static integration between the paired units. 3 and 4 were going to function in tandem, but essentially independently, each handling its own load with a shared connection point. During the build, I ran into a configuration problem with the connection architecture that forced me to rethink it." He turned to the relevant page. The revised drawing was clean and detailed. He heard Marcus Webb put his reading glasses on. "What I ended up with," Ethan continued, "is a dynamic integration. The 2 units communicate load in real time through a mechanical feedback loop I hadn't originally designed for. When one unit is under higher demand, the other compensates automatically. You don't need external sensors or control systems to manage the balance. The configuration manages it through the mechanical relationship itself." Silence. Daniel leaned forward. "Show me where." Ethan showed him. Daniel looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he picked up a pen and pointed at a junction in the drawing. "This connection here, what's the tolerance?" Ethan told him. "And you tested that?" "On the bench, yes. The data's in the back of the binder." Daniel turned to the back of the binder. Sophia watched Daniel instead of the binder. Ethan watched Sophia. Marcus Webb had not said anything yet. He was studying the drawing with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was doing real analysis rather than reacting. He turned to the next page, turned back. tilted the binder slightly as if changing the angle of his view would show him something different. "Where did this come from?" Marcus asked, without looking up. "The redesign," I explained. "The configuration problem forced—" "No." Marcus looked up. "I mean, where did the idea come from? The mechanical feedback loop, the self-balancing integration. Where did that concept originate?" Ethan thought about it. The honest answer: "The problem I was solving was mechanical. I needed the connection architecture to handle a physical constraint. The feedback loop was a consequence of the solution. It wasn't something I set out to design." "You discovered it while solving something else." "Yes." Marcus and Sophia exchanged a look that Ethan couldn't fully read. Something was being communicated between them that had context he wasn't part of. "That's going to be relevant," Marcus said to Sophia, in a tone that suggested they would be talking about this later. Sophia said nothing to that. She turned back to Ethan. "Walk me through the bench test results." He walked them through it. All of it. The setup, the methodology, what the numbers showed, and critically, what they didn't show and why a bench test was limited. He didn't oversell the results. He'd found over 12 years that the people worth impressing were the ones who noticed when you were overselling, and the cost of getting caught doing it was higher than the cost of presenting honestly limited data. Honestly. Daniel asked 7 questions. They were hard questions, the kind that came from someone who knew enough to find the gaps. Ethan answered 5 of them directly, said, "I don't have enough data yet," to one of them, and said, "I hadn't considered that," to the last one, which was about a thermal behavior question at sustained high load that the bench test hadn't been designed to address. Daniel wrote something on his tablet. Ethan couldn't see what. "You have 5 more units," Sophia said. "Yes." "At various stages. 2 are essentially complete pending the integration work. 3 and 4 are ready for the dynamic integration once I finalize the configuration based on what the first unit showed me. 5 and 6 still need significant work." "How long to complete the system?" He'd estimated this carefully before Monday. 6 weeks if nothing else goes sideways. 8 if something does. "Something always goes sideways," Marcus said. "I know," Ethan said. 8 weeks. Sophia leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not a dismissive gesture, but the specific posture of someone running calculations in their head. Then she looked back at him. "The contract's milestone payment. You're past the trigger." "I know." "You'll have it by end of week." She paused. "I want weekly check-ins going forward. Not formal presentations, just updates. Email's fine." "Okay." "And I want Daniel to visit the workshop." She said it with the flat matter-of-factness of someone stating a logistical point, not asking a question. Ethan looked at Daniel. Daniel looked back at him with the neutral expression of someone who had been told he was going to do something and was fine with it. "That's fine," Ethan said. He was about to close the binder when Marcus Webb said, "What's that?" and pointed at the second notebook, which Ethan had set on the table and then forgotten about. "Notes?" Ethan said. "Technical?" A beat. "Not exactly." Marcus looked at him steadily. He was the kind of man who had clearly spent decades in rooms where people were deciding what to tell him and what to keep back, and he had developed the patience of someone who was comfortable waiting for the real answer. "It's a second line of thinking," Ethan said, "parallel to the technical work, about what the project implies beyond the immediate application." Meaning what? He hadn't intended to get into this today. He'd told himself before coming in that today was about the technical work, the bench results, the revised design. The second notebook was premature was the word he'd been using in his own head. Unfinished, too large to present without more development. But Marcus Webb was looking at him, and Sophia was looking at him, and Daniel had put his pen down, and the room was quiet. Meaning that the specific problem of these 6 motors is actually a version of a much larger problem, he said. Industrial equipment gets retired based on the assessment that it can't be restored to spec. That assessment is usually correct about restoration, but it asks the wrong question. Restoration to original spec is one option. Rebuilding into something new is another, and right now that option doesn't really exist as a structured methodology. Nobody's built the framework for it because nobody's thought of failed equipment as raw material rather than waste. The room was still quiet. I've been building that framework, he said, in that notebook, as a parallel to the technical work, because the technical work is the proof of concept for the framework. Marcus Webb took off his reading glasses and set them on the legal pad. How far along is the framework? Not far enough to present formally, but it's there. Sophia was very still in the way she went still sometimes when she was thinking at speed. He'd noticed it during the facility tour, the way her external activity level dropped when her internal processing ramped up. Leave the notebook, she said. He looked at it. At the 11 weeks of late-night thinking in varying states of coherence and completeness, the margins with half-finished ideas, the sections that contradicted earlier sections because he'd changed his mind. It was not a polished document. It was emphatically not a polished document. It's not ready to share, he said. I know. Leave it anyway. He looked at her for a moment, then he pushed the notebook across the table. She didn't pick it up. She put her hand on the cover and left it there, the way you'd rest a hand on something you were going to come back to. Finish the system, she said. The 6 weeks or the 8 weeks, whatever it takes. Weekly emails to me and Daniel both. We'll talk again when it's done. He stood, gathered the binder, shook hands with Marcus Webb, who had a firm handshake and said interesting work in the tone of someone who meant it precisely and not more than it. In the elevator, Patricia made small talk about the weather again, and he responded appropriately. In the parking lot, he sat in his car for a few minutes. He'd left the notebook. He wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. He drove back to Clement Street and went to work. Daniel showed up at the garage the following Thursday. He arrived at 9, which was what Ethan had suggested, and he brought his own coffee and didn't bring anyone with him, which Ethan appreciated. The two of them moved through the space in a way that established quickly that Daniel was someone who knew how to be in a working space. He looked where he was supposed to look and didn't touch things without asking, and asked specific questions rather than general ones. He spent 40 minutes on the completed first unit, then on the 2 near-complete units. He looked at the revised integration design in the drawings, then at the actual components, then at the drawings again. The feedback loop, he said, crouching to look at the junction point on the first unit. You machined this yourself? Howard's shop. I gave him the spec. What's Howard's background? 20 years as a machinist, mostly precision work. Daniel examined the junction. This is tight work. He's good. Daniel stood up and looked at the garage as a whole, the motors, the folding table, the toolbox, the bare bulb, and the single 220-volt outlet with its questionable wiring. You did all of this in here? Yes. He was quiet for a moment, not a dismissive quiet, more like the quiet of someone recalibrating something. I told Sophia, after your first presentation, that the concept was sound, but the execution risk was high, Daniel said. Because of all of this. He didn't make it an insult, it was a statement of fact. Single person, no facility, limited equipment. I know, Ethan said. You weren't wrong. No. He looked at the first completed unit. But the execution is better than I expected. I want to be honest with you about that. Ethan looked at him. I appreciate it. The dynamic integration, Daniel stopped, started again. I've been an engineer for 6 years. I've worked on systems that cost more to develop than your entire annual contract is worth, with teams of 12 people in full laboratory access. What you designed in that notebook, sitting at a kitchen table at whatever time of night, he shook his head, not finishing the sentence. It came from the problem, Ethan said. I wasn't trying to invent it. I was trying to solve a configuration issue. I know, that's actually my point. Daniel finished his coffee. Some of the most important things in engineering come from people who are trying to solve the specific problem in front of them instead of trying to be clever. You were paying attention to what the work was telling you. Ethan thought about that for a moment. About 11 weeks of concrete floors and cold mornings, and the specific discipline of listening to what a machine was saying rather than projecting what you expected it to say. The work tells you things, he said, if you're quiet enough to hear it. Daniel nodded slowly. I'm going to recommend to Sophia that we bring in a proper test environment for the completed system, not a bench. A full load test under controlled conditions. That would... Ethan paused. Yes, that would be good. It might change the numbers. It might improve them. The bench test was conservative. Or it might surface problems. That would also be useful information, Ethan said, which made Daniel look at him with something that might have been respect. Daniel left at noon. Ethan ate lunch at the folding table, a sandwich he'd packed because the budget was the budget, and then went back to work on Motor 5, which still had 3 specific grievances against being rebuilt, and which he was going to address one at a time. The milestone payment arrived as Sophia had said. He paid the rent on the garage and the next installment on the apartment, and Howard's invoice for the machined parts, and his share of Mia's school supplies that he'd been carrying on a mental tab since September. He recalculated what was left and what the final contract payment would be, and whether it covered the gap between now and whatever came after the meeting that would happen when the system was complete. It covered the gap, barely, if nothing went sideways. Something went sideways in week 13. Not the motors this time. Mia got sick, a genuine sick, not the vague complaint sick that kids sometimes deployed on school days, but a fever and cough sick that the school called about at 11:30 on a Tuesday, which meant Ethan drove to school to pick her up, took her home, got her settled with water and a blanket, and the specific movie she wanted, which was an animated thing about a dog that he had seen enough times to have memorized considerable portions of, and then sat at the kitchen table with his phone and rearranged his schedule in his head. She was sick for 4 days. He didn't go to the garage for 4 days. He worked at the kitchen table on what he could: the integration specifications, the documentation updates, the weekly email to Sophia and Daniel, which he wrote carefully and without mentioning that he'd lost a week, because he was not going to let that be the thing that defined the week in their accounting of his progress. On the second day, Mia, still fevered and horizontal on the couch, said, "You're not going to the garage. I'm working from here. Because of me. Because you're sick and you're 7 and you can't be home alone. That's just how it is." She looked at him with the guilty expression she got when she felt like she was causing a problem. It was an expression that broke his heart a little, every time, because she had been concerned about causing problems since she was 5 years old, and he had never fully figured out where that came from or how to talk her out of it. "I'm sorry," she said. "For being sick?" He came over and sat on the edge of the couch. "Mia, you can't apologize for being sick." "I know, but..." "No, you're not a problem. You're my kid. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at him. The fever made her eyes a little glassy. "Are you going to miss your deadline?" "There's no hard deadline. But you'll be behind." "A little. I'll make it up." He put his hand on her forehead, which was still too warm. "You want more water?" She nodded. He got her water. She fell asleep 20 minutes later, and he sat in the chair across from the couch and worked on his documentation with a laptop balanced on his knees. And outside the window, the November afternoon light went gray and then dark. When she came back to school on Monday, he went to the garage and worked until 9 in the evening. The 8-week estimate held, barely. The completed system was ready at the end of week 8 in 2 days, which Ethan counted as within tolerance. He sent the email to Sophia and Daniel on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in the garage with all 6 rebuilt units in front of him. He'd lined them up in a row, not to show off, just because it was the logical configuration for a system photograph, which he included in the email. 6 machines. 11 weeks of initial contract work, plus 4 more of continued development after the Monday meeting when the design had changed. 3 months and change of Clement Street mornings and late kitchen table nights, and 1 lost week to a fever, and 2 crises that had cost him days he didn't have. The email was 3 paragraphs. He described the completed system, noted the documentation was attached, and said he was available for the full load test whenever they wanted to schedule it. He pressed send, sat for a minute, then started cleaning up the garage, because the workspace had gotten into a state that would have bothered him if he let himself really look at it, and now that the main work was done, he could finally deal with it. Sophia called at 4:17. "When can you have the system transported?" she said. Not hello. She hadn't said hello on the phone once in 3 months. "It's ready to move whenever. I'd want to supervise the transport." "Of course. I'll have logistics call you today." A pause. "The test environment is set up. We've been scheduling around your timeline." He stopped what he was doing. "You set up the test environment before the system was complete?" Daniel was confident. She said it flatly, as if it were just a logistics decision. We'll run preliminary tests Monday, full load test Wednesday if the prelims are clean. And if they're not, then we figure out why and fix it. Another pause. The notebook. He'd been waiting for this since the Monday meeting. Yes. I've read it 3 times. Marcus has read it twice. She paused again, in the particular way she paused when she was deciding how to word something. It's not finished. I told you it wasn't. It's also not wrong. A brief silence. There are sections that are rough, concepts that need significant development before they're presentable as methodology. But the core argument, she stopped, started differently. How long have you been thinking about this? The framework, since the garage, since about week 3, seriously. Before that? He thought about it honestly. About 12 years at Hartwell, the times he'd watched equipment get retired and had the particular discomfort of knowing there was more left in it than the replacement decision accounted for. The times he'd fixed things that were supposed to be unfixable and had the quiet, private frustration of knowing the fix would never be documented because it didn't fit the standard process. Longer than 3 weeks, he said. I just didn't have a framework for it yet. Sophia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had something in it that was different from her usual register. Not softer exactly, but less guarded. You came to my facility with a worn-out toolbox and asked to look at junk motors. Yes. I thought... She stopped. I know what you thought, he said. Not bitterly, just factually. I was wrong, she said. 3 words, direct and clean, the way she did most things. Not just about the motors. He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside the roll-up door, which he'd left open for ventilation, a car went past on Clement Street. It was getting dark. Monday, he said. I'll be there for the transport. 8 o'clock. I'll be there at 7:45. He could hear faintly what might have been an exhaled breath on her end. Of course you will. She hung up. He went back to cleaning the garage. The transport went without incident. Ethan rode with the freight truck because he hadn't been joking about supervising it and because he'd spent 3 months building these machines and he was not going to hand them over to a logistics team and hope for the best. The driver, a man named Phil, who had been moving industrial equipment for 18 years, took the corner onto the Sterling Technologies loading dock with the particular care of someone who knew what he was doing, and Ethan appreciated that and told him so. First time anyone's told me that in a while, Phil said. People don't thank drivers enough. No, Phil said. They don't. The preliminary tests ran Monday and Tuesday. Daniel ran them with a team of 3 technicians, and Ethan was present for all of it. The test environment was climate-controlled and equipped with instrumentation that made his garage bench feel very humble, and Ethan stood back and watched with the specific discipline of not hovering. The technicians were professionals. They didn't need him breathing over them. His job right now was to be available if something needed explanation and otherwise stay out of the way. Monday's results were clean. Tuesday's found one issue, a vibration signature at high load on Unit 6 that wasn't in the acceptable range. Ethan knew where it was coming from before the technician finished describing it. A bearing fit on 6 had been his least confident work, a section where the corrosion had been deep enough that he'd been making judgment calls about what was viable. Can it be addressed? Daniel asked. Yes, I need 2 hours with it and 1 replacement component. We have the component. Of course you do, Ethan said, and Daniel looked at him with what was definitely a suppressed smile. 2 hours. 1 replacement bearing. Unit 6 went back on the test rig and ran clean. Wednesday was the full load test. Ethan arrived at 7:30. He was not scheduled to arrive until 8. The test wasn't scheduled to start until 9. He stood in the parking lot for 10 minutes, rechecked his documentation in the car, went in at 7:55. The test environment had more people in it than Monday and Tuesday. He recognized Daniel and the 3 technicians. There were 2 people he didn't recognize who had the bearing of senior staff. Marcus Webb was there, legal pad and all. And Sophia was there, standing near the instrumentation bank with a coffee she wasn't looking at, which was normal. She looked at him when he walked in, gave him a nod. He nodded back. The test took 4 hours. He didn't move much during it. There was a chair someone had put near the observation area, and he sat in it and watched the instrumentation readouts with the focused stillness he got when something had his full attention. The numbers came up in real time on the display screens: load, efficiency, output, the specific metrics that would tell the story of whether what he'd built was what he'd said it was. The dynamic integration was visible in the data from the first hour. The self-balancing behavior between units 3 and 4 showed up exactly as designed. When load on 3 increased, 4 compensated, automatically, without external signal, exactly as the mechanical feedback loop was designed to produce. One of the two people he didn't recognize walked closer to the display screen and stood there for several minutes. At the 2-hour mark, one of the technicians said something to Daniel in a low voice. Daniel's face did something that Ethan was too far away to read clearly. At the 3-hour mark, Marcus Webb wrote something on his legal pad. He underlined it. At 4 hours, the test concluded. The technicians began running through the post-test checklist. The room had the particular charged quiet of people who have seen something they need a moment to process. Daniel pulled up the efficiency data on a tablet and walked over to where Ethan was sitting. He turned the tablet so Ethan could see it. The efficiency improvement over the original motor specifications was not what Ethan had projected. It was higher. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make headlines, but in the precise, measurable, technically significant way that people who understood industrial systems would understand immediately. "That's," Daniel said, and didn't finish. "I know," Ethan said. "The self-balancing behavior is particularly—" "I know." Daniel looked at him. "You knew this was going to happen." "I thought it might," Ethan said carefully. "I didn't know." Sophia appeared beside Daniel. She looked at the tablet, then at Ethan. "Conference room," she said. 20 minutes. You, me, Marcus, Daniel." She walked out of the test environment without waiting for a response. The conference room, the smaller one, the one from the post-Monday morning meeting, had water on the table this time, and someone had brought in a tray of food that nobody touched. Ethan sat on one side of the table. Sophia, Marcus, and Daniel sat on the other, which was not a comfortable arrangement but was probably not intentional. Marcus opened with his legal pad. He had, Ethan saw, filled 3 pages during the 4-hour test. "The efficiency numbers need to go through our full analysis process before anything is formalized," Marcus said. "That's going to take 2 to 3 weeks minimum, but the preliminary picture is clear enough that I don't think we need to wait for that to have this conversation." Sophia said, "What's the preliminary picture?" "The system outperforms our current baseline in the target application by a margin that's commercially significant. The dynamic integration is the primary driver." Marcus looked at his pad. "I've also been thinking about the framework in the notebook and about what this test demonstrates relative to that framework. And I think, and I want to be careful here, that what we're looking at is not a project. It's an approach." Silence. "An approach to what?" Ethan asked, though he knew. "To industrial equipment lifecycle management," Marcus said. "If the methodology in that notebook can be developed and systematized, the application isn't limited to these motors or to this class of equipment. The question is whether equipment that currently gets retired and scrapped can be evaluated through a different framework, one that asks what it could become rather than whether it can be restored." Ethan put both hands flat on the table. He looked at Marcus Webb, then at Daniel, then at Sophia. Sophia was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the professional neutrality she usually maintained. Something more direct than that. More personal. "You knew that's where this was going," she said. "From the first day you looked at those motors." He thought about the storage room, the buzzing fluorescent lights, 6 dead machines against a wall, the way his mind had started calculating before he'd consciously told it to. "Not new," he said. "Suspected. There's a difference." And the notebook was you developing the suspicion. The notebook was me trying to figure out if the suspicion was right. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that was, for Sophia Sterling, remarkable in its plainness. "I almost threw you out after the facility tour," she said. "Your toolbox, the way you looked at those motors. I thought you were... I didn't think you were what you are." The room was quiet. "What changed your mind?" he asked. "You called me back," she said. "Most people in your position don't call back." They wait, they're polite, they don't push. She paused. You called back because you'd seen something and you weren't going to leave without finding out if you were right. He thought about Mia at the kitchen table, telling him that things don't get fixed by looking at them. I had some advice, he said. Marcus Webb, who had been patient during this exchange, cleared his throat gently. I'd like to discuss next steps. Yes, Sophia said. She straightened in her chair. The momentary directness was still there, but she was back in the mode Ethan had come to recognize, processing at speed, moving forward. So would I. What followed was 90 minutes of the most consequential conversation Ethan Ryder had ever sat in. He said less than Marcus and Sophia and Daniel combined, but what he said was specific and careful, and he did not agree to things he wasn't certain about, which he noticed Sophia noticed. At the end of it, what was on the table, not finalized, not formal, contingent on the full analysis completing without surprises, was this: a formal expansion of the project into a structured research and development initiative, a proper workspace, not a garage on Clement Street, a team, with Ethan at the technical lead, and the notebook, taken seriously as the foundation of a methodology that Sterling Technologies wanted to develop. The word partnership had not been used yet, but Marcus had used the word co-development, and Sophia had not corrected him. Ethan drove home in the November dark. He picked up Mia from Marcus's, his brother-in-law Marcus, not Marcus Webb, though the collision of names in his head felt briefly absurd, and she was in the car before he'd fully stopped, and then she was looking at him with those eyes that noticed things. What happened? She asked. A lot. Good a lot or bad a lot? He thought about 6 motors against a wall, a notebook full of late-night thinking, a bearing replaced in 2 hours, numbers on a tablet screen. Good a lot, he said. She sat back in her seat. She didn't ask more questions, which meant she understood that more questions weren't what the moment needed. They drove home through the dark city, and he tried to figure out how to explain to a 7-year-old that the thing she'd written 4 pages about, her father looking at broken things and seeing what they could become, had just been confirmed in a controlled test environment with professional instrumentation to be real. He wasn't sure he had the words yet. He'd find them. He had time. The formal offer arrived on a Friday, 12 days after the full load test. Not an email. A printed document, delivered by courier to the apartment on a morning when Ethan was standing in the kitchen in his work clothes eating toast over the sink because Mia had used the last clean bowl for cereal and he hadn't gotten to the dishes the night before. He signed for the package without knowing what it was, set it on the counter, and finished the toast before opening it. The document was 22 pages. He read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He read it twice. Then he called a woman named Renata, who was a contracts attorney he'd found through a referral from Carl, who had apparently known a contracts attorney for reasons he'd never fully explained. Renata charged a flat fee for document review, which was the only kind of fee Ethan could afford to engage with, and she called him back the following Tuesday. It's a co-development agreement, Renata said, not an employment contract. That distinction is important. You're not being hired. You're being brought in as a co-developer on the intellectual property that comes out of this initiative. What does that mean in practice? It means you retain a share of the IP you generate. The specific share is negotiable. What they've offered here is weighted in their favor, but the structure allows for it. There's also a revenue participation clause in Section 14 that's written somewhat loosely, which is either an oversight or intentional, and in either case you want it tightened before you sign. What would tightening it look like? She told him. He took notes. The workspace and resources provision in Section 7 is solid, she continued. They're committing to real infrastructure. The team-building authority is somewhat limited. They retain final approval on hires. That's not unusual for a junior co-development arrangement, but I'd push for at least input rights on direct technical staff. How long will negotiation take? Depends on how responsive they are. Could be a week, could be 3. He looked at the apartment rent notice on the refrigerator, held there by a magnet Mia had made at school, a small clay disc painted to look like a sun. The new lease terms. $340 more per month, effective in 6 weeks. Push on the IP share and the revenue clause, he said. The team building I can live with as is for now. Understood. I'll draft a response by Thursday. He hung up and sat for a moment. Then he called Sophia's direct line. She picked up on the second ring. "You got the document?" "I did. My attorney is reviewing it." "Good." No irritation in her voice that he could detect. "That's what you should do. I want to talk to you about Section 7 before the formal response goes back." "The workspace provision." "Yes." He paused. "Not to negotiate it down, to understand what you're actually offering before I ask for modifications I might not need." A brief silence. "That's an unusual way to approach a negotiation. I found that understanding what something is before you try to change it usually leads to better changes." He heard her exhale something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Come in Thursday. We'll walk through it together." Thursday's meeting was not in the small conference room. It was in Sophia's actual office, which Ethan had not been in before, and which was not what he'd expected. Less glass and chrome executive theater, more functional space. A large desk covered in working documents, not decorative objects. Bookshelves with technical texts alongside business ones. A whiteboard along one wall with what looked like a current project schematic that someone had drawn with different colored markers over the course of multiple sessions, earlier marks visible underneath the newer ones. He looked at the whiteboard for a moment longer than he probably should have. "My engineers use the conference rooms," Sophia said, following his gaze. "I like to work where I can see things." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit." He sat. She was already pulling up something on her screen. "Section 7, she said. "What's your question?" "What's the actual physical space you're proposing?" "We have a facility on the north side, former component testing lab, about 4,500 square feet. It's been used for storage for the past 18 months, so there's cleanup involved, but the infrastructure is there. 3-phase power, climate control, compressed air, 4 test bays. We'd kit it out for the specific requirements of the initiative." Ethan thought about the garage on Clement Street, the bare bulb, the questionable wiring on the 220-volt outlet, 4,500 square feet with 3-phase power and climate control and 4 test bays. "Who has operational authority over the space?" he asked. "You would, for the initiative's work. Facilities management handles maintenance and compliance, but you'd direct the working environment." "And the team?" "We'd start with 3 people, 2 engineers and a technician. You'd have input on selection from our existing staff, and for any external hires, we'd run the recruitment jointly." Section 7 says final approval on hires stays with Sterling Technologies. "It does." She looked at him steadily. "Because we're writing the checks. But in practice, I'm not going to impose people on your technical team. That would defeat the purpose. I'd want that in writing. As an addendum, yes, that's reasonable." He nodded. "The IP share. My attorney flagged it. I expected she would. What's your position?" "The split is written as 70-30 in Sterling's favor. For the foundational methodology work, framework in the notebook. I want 50-50. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who was going to say no, the quiet of someone running a calculation. "The notebook is incomplete." The motors were rusted. Pause. Something shifted in her expression. Not amusement exactly, but recognition. 50-50 on the foundational methodology. Applications developed subsequent to the framework, 60-40 Sterling. With right of first refusal if I want to license applications independently. That I'll need to take to our legal team. "Take it to them. I'll wait." She looked at him across the desk. This was a different conversation than any they'd had in the test environment or the conference rooms. More direct, less mediated by the technical content between them. He'd wondered occasionally over the past months who Sophia Sterling was when she wasn't being the youngest billionaire in the industrial technology sector. This felt closer to an answer. She was someone who was most comfortable when the terms were clear and both parties knew what they were negotiating. "You're different than I initially assessed," she said. Not an apology, an observation. "You said that already, on the phone after the test." "I'm saying it again because it's relevant to this conversation." She folded her hands on the desk. "When you came to the facility tour, I made a judgment based on what I saw. The clothes, the toolbox, the work history that looked like a solid mechanic, not someone building methodology." "You weren't entirely wrong," he said. I'm a mechanic who built methodology. The order matters. She considered that. The order matters, she repeated slowly. Yes, I think that's actually why the methodology works, because it came from someone who started with their hands on the machine rather than a whiteboard. Marcus said something similar. Marcus is rarely wrong about intellectual work. He's occasionally wrong about people, but rarely about ideas. She picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, put it back down. I want to tell you something that isn't part of the negotiation. He waited. My first company. Not Sterling Technologies, the one before when I was 24. I ran it for 16 months before it became clear that the approach I'd built it on was flawed. Not the business fundamentals, the technical approach. I'd built a system around a concept that looked right on paper and turned out to be wrong in application. She said it without apparent distress, the way you described something that had resolved into history. I shut it down myself, before anyone made me. I went through every piece of equipment we had, and I wrote off what was useless and salvaged what wasn't, and I found, in that process, that about 40% of what I'd been ready to write off wasn't actually useless. Ethan looked at her. That's how you know these motors. I've been in that position, looking at equipment that someone said was junk and thinking, is it, or is it junk for this purpose? She paused. I recognized something in the way you looked at those motors in the storage room. I didn't know what it was at the time. I know now. He sat with that for a moment. The fluorescent lights in the storage room, 6 corroded machines. Sophia Sterling watching him the way people watch something they couldn't quite account for. Why didn't you hire me? He asked. Not with resentment. He'd moved past that, or thought he had. Genuinely curious, because hiring you would have put you in a structure that wasn't built for what you were going to produce. The contract was the right vehicle, even if I didn't know that when I offered it. And now? Now we're having this conversation, she said, which is the right vehicle for what comes next. The legal back and forth took 16 days. Renata, to her considerable credit, was thorough and fast and did not let the size of the other party's legal team intimidate her into accepting language she didn't like. There were 2 phone calls and a revised document and one tense afternoon where Ethan sat in the apartment waiting for a call that came 3 hours later than expected. And then the call was fine, and the holdup had been an internal review process on Sterling's side that had nothing to do with him. He signed on a Wednesday. Renata got her flat fee plus a bonus he had to budget carefully for, but which felt correct. He signed the lease termination on the Clement Street garage the same week. He called Dale, who accepted the news with the same zero-question energy he'd brought to every interaction. Ethan cleaned the space out over 2 days, which involved less material than you'd think. Most of what had been in there had belonged to the project and had already been transported to Sterling. What remained was his toolbox, the folding table which belonged to him, and an accumulation of the small detritus of months of work, coffee cups, receipts, a jacket he'd left hanging on a nail and forgotten about. 3 notebooks full of details he'd already transcribed to the more organized documentation. On the last day, before locking up, he stood in the empty space for a moment. The bare bulb, the concrete floor with its oil stains and the 2 spots where he'd been on his knees often enough that the concrete was faintly cleaner there than around it. The 220-volt outlet with its questionable wiring that he'd never formally reported to anyone because Dale didn't ask questions and Ethan had learned to work with it. 3.5 months. 6 motors, 1 notebook that had turned into a co-development agreement. He turned off the light and locked the door and didn't look back, because he'd learned that looking back at empty spaces didn't give you anything you didn't already have. The Northside facility needed 3 weeks of prep before it was operational. Ethan spent that time doing things he'd been deferring, proper sleep, for one, which he approached with the same systematic intention he brought to work problems and which took about a week before his body stopped waking him at 3 in the morning out of the pure momentum of anxiety. He painted the wall in Mia's room the color she'd been asking for, a particular blue-green that she'd described as the inside of the ocean, and that he'd found, eventually, at a paint store on Merchant Street. He called Carl, and they sat on Carl's porch for 2 hours with decaf, and Carl said almost nothing during the entire visit, which Ethan recognized as Carl's version of celebration. He also spent time developing the presentation that Marcus Webb had asked for, a formal articulation of the framework from the notebook, organized and structured for an audience that would include people from Sterling's board. Ethan did not love writing in the formal register that presentations required. He found it constrictive in the same way that a blueprint was constrictive compared to a working drawing. Necessary, but something was always lost in the translation from thinking to presenting. He called Marcus twice during the drafting process. Marcus was the person at Sterling who was most useful to him in this specific way, not for technical feedback, but for the kind of structural thinking about ideas that Ethan's own training hadn't fully developed. Marcus had spent 20 years in R&D leadership and knew how to make an argument land with a board. "You're burying the lead," Marcus told him on the second call. "What's the lead?" "That what you're proposing isn't a product, it's a practice. You keep presenting it as a system, and it's not a system. It's a way of asking questions about equipment that most engineers aren't trained to ask." Ethan thought about that. If I present it as a practice, they'll ask where the revenue model is. And you'll tell them that the revenue model is in what the practice produces, not in the practice itself. Which is true. And which is a more interesting pitch than here is a new type of rebuilt motor. He restructured the presentation that evening. It was better. The North Side facility opened being a relative term, meaning it was cleaned out and kitted and had power and climate control and was ready for work. On a Tuesday in January. Ethan arrived before anyone else, as was now established pattern, and walked through the 4 test bays and the open floor space and the equipment that Sterling's facilities team had installed according to the spec he'd submitted. It was not perfect. One of the test bays had a drainage issue he'd need to address. The compressed air line had a slow leak at a junction he found by listening, which was the fastest way to find slow leaks and a skill that only worked if you were quiet. One of the climate control zones wasn't calibrated quite right, running 2 degrees warmer than the setting indicated. He wrote these things down and addressed them in order over the first 2 days, because you worked in the space you actually had, not the space you'd spec'd. The team arrived on Wednesday. 2 engineers from Sterling's existing staff, a woman named Priya, who had 7 years of experience in materials testing and who shook Ethan's hand with the frank manner of someone who had no particular investment in hierarchy, and a man named Joe, who was younger, maybe 25, and who looked at the facility with barely contained excitement that he was not quite professional enough to fully suppress. The technician was a man named Dale, not the same Dale, a different one, which produced a brief and completely internal moment of adjustment for Ethan, who was in his 40s and had worked industrial testing environments for 15 years, and who, within the first hour, independently identified both the compressed air leak and the climate control calibration issue. Ethan revised his estimate of Dale significantly upward. The first team meeting happened that afternoon, all 4 of them around a table in the small office space off the main floor. Ethan had thought about how to run this meeting for 2 weeks. He'd managed people at Hartwell, had been a department supervisor for the last 3 of his 12 years there, but this was different. The context was different, the purpose was different, and the particular challenge of being simultaneously the technical lead and the person with the least institutional standing in the organization was something he was navigating in real time. He decided not to do the thing where you opened with a vision statement. They were all adults with the documentation. They'd read it or they hadn't. "The first project is the second-generation development of the system from the contract work," he said. "You've all seen the test results and the initial design documentation. The goal for the first 6 weeks is to develop the dynamic integration concept to the point where we can test it at full industrial scale, not prototype scale. That means understanding its limits as well as its capabilities." He looked at each of them. "I want to know what doesn't work as much as what does." That's not a nice thing to say. It's the actual job. Problems that get caught here are problems that don't get caught in a client's facility. Clear? Priya nodded. Joe said yes and meant it. Dale had been nodding since the second sentence. "Questions?" Ethan asked. Joe raised his hand slightly, a gesture that looked like it had come from a classroom and hadn't fully transitioned to a professional setting. "The framework document, the one Mr. Webb mentioned in the kickoff briefing. Are we going to be working on that in parallel?" "Eventually. Right now, the framework develops through the work. I'm not going to schedule time for it separately because I've found that thinking about the framework separately from the technical work produces worse framework." He paused. "That might change. If you have thoughts about the framework as we go, write them down and bring them to me. Don't filter them. Joe looked like someone who had a lot of unfiltered thoughts he'd been waiting for permission to have. The first 6 weeks of the initiative were the hardest thing Ethan had managed since the garage, for different reasons. The garage had been physically and financially punishing. This was interpersonally complex in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. Managing a team of capable people toward a goal that was still partially undefined, the second-generation development had clear technical parameters, but the edges of the framework work were genuinely uncertain, required him to hold multiple levels of the work in his head simultaneously in a way that was different from single-person problem-solving. Priya was excellent and direct, and would tell him clearly when she disagreed with a technical decision, which he valued and occasionally found startling because Hartwell's culture had not been one where junior team members challenged supervisors directly. He told her at the end of week 2 that she should keep doing it. "I will," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you meant it." "I always mean it." She'd looked at him with a slight lift of one eyebrow. "In my experience, about 60% of managers who say that actually mean it." "I'm not a manager," he said. "I'm the person who's been doing this alone in a garage for 3 months. You catching something I missed is exactly the point." She'd seemed satisfied with that answer. Joe was less immediately efficient and more immediately creative. He had the habit of going sideways on a problem, arriving at a solution through a path that didn't follow the obvious sequence, which was sometimes exactly right and sometimes cost him time he didn't have. Ethan spent more management energy on Joe than on the others, mostly in the form of checking in early enough in a task to redirect before he was too far down a wrong path. After one such redirection in week 3, Joe sat with it for a minute and then said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "How did you know that approach wasn't going to work, before I'd actually tried it?" Ethan thought about how to answer that honestly. "I've made that specific mistake myself, about 6 years ago, at Hartwell. Different context, same underlying assumption about load distribution. I burned 3 days on it." Joe processed this. "So you recognized it from your own experience?" "Yes." I thought you were just seeing something I was missing." "I was seeing something you were missing," Ethan said. "It just came from having already missed it myself." Joe went back to the problem. He came back 2 hours later with a different approach that was clean and thoughtful, and Ethan said so. The board presentation happened in week 5. Marcus had arranged it, 30 minutes with Sophia present and 7 board members attending. Ethan had presented to Hartwell's management team enough times to know how to stand in a room without feeling diminished by it, but this was different in scale and stakes, and he was honest with himself about that. He wore the button-down shirt, not the interview one. He'd bought a new one, better quality, when the milestone payment had allowed it. He still ironed the collar twice. The presentation ran 28 minutes. He followed the restructured version, the one where the framework was a practice rather than a system. He showed the test data from the full load test. He showed the second-generation projections. He explained as clearly as he knew how what the methodology meant for industrial equipment lifecycle management at scale. There were 11 questions. He answered 9 directly, said, "That's outside my technical expertise, but Marcus can speak to it on the finance question," and on the last question, from a board member who had been quiet for the full presentation and had the particular stillness of someone who was listening rather than waiting to speak, said something that was not in his prepared material at all. The question was, "What made you think the motors were worth looking at when our own engineers had concluded they weren't?" He thought about the storage room, the buzzing lights, the way the housing geometry of the nearest motor was visible even through the rust. "I wasn't trying to prove your engineers wrong," he said. "I was asking a different question. They asked whether the motors could be restored. I asked whether the question of restoration was the only question worth asking." He paused. If you go into a situation assuming the only options are what you already know about, you miss the options you don't know about yet. I just happened to be looking for options I didn't know about yet. The board member nodded slowly, wrote something down. Sophia, from the corner of the room, said nothing. But she was watching him with the particular attention she brought to things she considered significant. The initiative approval, full funding, 18-month runway, expansion authority, if the second-generation results justified it, came through 4 days later. He was at the facility when Sophia called. He was kneeling next to one of the test bays working through the drainage issue with Dale, who had brought a level and a particular opinion about the probable cause. And his phone rang, and he stood up and answered it, and Sophia said, "You have your 18 months," and then gave him the budget number. He repeated the number in his head twice to make sure he'd heard it correctly. "That's a significant commitment," he said. "It's a significant methodology," she said. "Don't make me regret it." "I'll try not to." "Ethan." She used his first name rarely, and when she did, it signaled something different than the usual operational register. "The board member who asked you the last question, the one who was quiet." "Yes. That's Harold Vance. He's been on the board for 12 years, and he has never written something down during a presentation before. Not in any presentation I've given in 6 years of reporting to that board." Ethan stood in the test bay with Dale looking up at him from the floor with professional patience. "What did he write?" I asked him. A pause. He wrote out, "This person understands something most engineers don't know they're missing." The line was quiet for a moment. "Okay," Ethan said. "That's all you have to say?" "I don't know what else to say to that." A brief pause. "Neither do I. Congratulations. Go fix whatever you're working on." She hung up. He went back to the drainage issue, which he and Dale resolved by the end of the afternoon through a combination of the level, a redirected drain line, and Dale's particular opinion about slope gradient, which turned out to be correct. That evening, he told Mia about the 18 months. He didn't give her the budget number because she was 7, and budget numbers were not the relevant information. "So the project is real now?" she said. "Like, officially?" "It was real before," he said. "Now it has resources." She thought about the distinction. "Is that better?" "Yes. It means I can do more of it, and I don't have to do it in a cold garage with a bad light." She considered this with the gravity of someone evaluating an important upgrade. "Good. The cold garage was worrying me." "You didn't say anything." "You were working," she said, as if that were a complete explanation. Then, "Dad, what happens if the new place has bad lights too?" "Then I fix the lights," he said. "That's what I do." She accepted that, satisfied. He did the dishes and helped her with the reading assignment that was due and watched 40 minutes of the dog movie that he had now seen enough times to genuinely dislike without being able to admit it. And after she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the technical notebook. Not the framework notebook. That one lived at the facility now, part of the project documentation. The technical notebook, the original one, with the rough drawings from the first weeks in the garage and the component lists and the margin notes that had been the beginning of everything. He hadn't opened it in weeks. He opened it now and read through it from the beginning, which took about 40 minutes. The early drawings made him wince once or twice. The assumptions he'd been working from before the material started, teaching him things were visible in retrospect. The notes from the week of the redesign were dense and slightly chaotic, the compressed record of thinking that had happened fast and under pressure. He read the entry from the night after the drainage problem in Motor 5, the night he'd sat on the concrete floor and called Mia, and she'd told him that going was enough for tonight. Then he closed the notebook. He wasn't done. 18 months of funding was a beginning, not a finish, and the second-generation work had a full set of open questions that were going to take months to answer, and the framework was still developing in ways that he couldn't fully predict. And somewhere downstream there were applications of the methodology that he hadn't imagined yet. But the thing that had started in a storage room with buzzing fluorescent lights and 6 rusted motors was real. It had test data and a budget and a team and a board member who had written something down for the first time in 12 years. He put the notebook in the kitchen drawer, not thrown away, not archived, just put away, and went to bed. He slept the whole night through, which had been rare enough lately that he noticed when it happened. He noticed it in the morning when the alarm went off at 6:30, and he realized he hadn't been awake at 3. He lay there for a moment in the gray, early morning light before getting up, just aware of the fact of having slept. Then Mia knocked on the door and said, "Dad, we're out of cereal." And the day started like days started, specifically, imperfectly, needing attention. And he got up and dealt with it. The apartment still had the crack above the living room window. The landlord still hadn't fixed it. Ethan had patched it himself a second time, better than the first. And it held. Some things you fix yourself, some things you wait for. The trick was knowing which was which, and he'd gotten better at that slowly, the way you got better at most things. He drove to the North Side facility at 8:15, walked in at 8:28, and found Priya already at her workstation, and Dale inspecting the compressed airline he'd fixed the previous week, with the systematic suspicion of someone who had been let down by fixed things before. "Still holding," Dale said, without turning around. "Good," Ethan said. He put his toolbox down, the same one, the 9-year-old one with the re-welded handle and the latch that needed the exact angle, and opened it and got to work. The 18 months did not pass cleanly. Nothing worth doing ever does. There was a stretch in month 4 where the second-generation development hit a wall that Ethan spent 3 weeks staring at from different angles before finding the way through. A thermal behavior problem at sustained load, the one Daniel had flagged in the preliminary tests, which turned out to be more complex than any of them had initially assessed, and which required Priya to essentially rebuild her understanding of the material tolerances from the ground up. She did it without complaint, which was the specific kind of professionalism that Ethan had come to recognize as rare. She did it correctly, which was rarer. In month 7, Joe made a mistake. A significant one. A miscalculation in the load distribution spec for the third-generation prototype that Ethan caught during a review, but not before Dale had already begun fabrication on 2 components to the wrong tolerance. The components were unusable. The cost in time and materials was real. Ethan sat with Joe in the small office off the main floor after the review. Joe looked the way young engineers looked when they'd made a significant mistake and knew it, held in the specific tension of someone waiting to find out how bad the consequence was going to be. "Walk me through how it happened," Ethan said. Joe did. The explanation was honest and specific, which mattered. He didn't minimize or deflect. The error had come from an assumption he'd made early in the calculation without checking it, a small thing that had compounded. "I should have checked the assumption," Joe said. "Yes." "I thought I knew it." "That's where most errors come from," Ethan said. "Not from the things you know you don't know. From the things you think you do." He paused. "How many times have you made this specific mistake before?" Joe blinked. "This is the first time." "Then you've paid for that lesson once. That's how it's supposed to work." Ethan leaned back. "Write up what happened. Full account, your own analysis of how to prevent it. Bring it to team review Friday. Not because you're in troubles, because the team learns from your mistake the same as you do, and that's worth more than the 2 components." Joe looked at him. "That's it?" "That's it. Fix the calculation. Let Dale know the revised spec by end of day." Joe went out and Ethan sat for a moment in the empty office thinking about the mistake he'd described to Joe in week 3. The one from Hartwell 6 years ago, the wrong assumption about load distribution. He'd had a supervisor who'd handled it in a way that had cost Ethan 6 months of hesitancy before he trusted his own calculations again. He had thought about that supervisor occasionally over the years since, without anger, but with the specific clarity of understanding how a management choice could shape a person's work long after the moment passed. You made the choices you made, and they had effects you couldn't always track. The only thing you could do was try to make them in the direction of something useful. The framework methodology, the thing that had lived in the second notebook and had become the formal documentation that Marcus Webb had spent 6 months helping Ethan develop into presentable form, was published as a Sterling Technologies white paper in month 9. Marcus had insisted on the white paper before any commercial application because he believed, correctly, that the right sequence was credibility first, application second. The white paper was 43 pages. Ethan's name was on it alongside Marcus's, which Ethan had not fully expected until he saw the proof and had a moment of staring at his own name on a formal research document that he did not entirely know how to process. The methodology was called Adaptive Life Cycle Reassessment, ALA, which was Marcus's language, cleaner and more formal than anything Ethan would have come up with. The core argument was the one that had been accumulating since the garage, that industrial equipment retirement decisions were being made against a framework that asked only whether equipment could be restored to original function, and that a parallel framework asking what equipment could become, given its surviving structural and mechanical characteristics, had the potential to fundamentally alter life cycle cost calculations across the industry. The white paper was not immediately incendiary. It circulated in industry channels for about 6 weeks with modest but real engagement, the kind of initial response that Marcus had predicted, and which he described as the right kind of slow, meaning the people who were responding seriously rather than reflexively. Then a manufacturing consortium in the industrial Midwest cited it in a procurement review. Then a trade publication ran a piece on it. Then Marcus forwarded Ethan an email from an engineering school in the Northeast that wanted to discuss curriculum implications. This is what traction looks like when it starts from the right place, Marcus told him during a check-in that month. It's slow, Ethan said. Ideas that last start slow. Ideas that burn fast usually burn out. Marcus adjusted his reading glasses. You're not in a hurry, are you? Ethan thought about that, about the garage on Clement Street, about 3.5 months of 6.5-hour workdays and late kitchen table nights, about what it felt like to be in a hurry when you had no choice, and what it felt like now, when the work had its own momentum. No, he said, not anymore. The partnership conversation happened in month 11, not the co-development agreement, which had been the formal structure from the start. An actual partnership conversation initiated by Sophia in her office with the whiteboard and the working documents, with no legal team present, which Ethan had learned to recognize as the setting she chose when she wanted to talk about something real rather than something formal. She told him what she was proposing before she told him the terms, which he'd come to understand was how she operated. The logic first, the numbers second, because she believed that if you didn't agree on the logic, the numbers were irrelevant. The logic was this. The ALA methodology, developed as a Sterling initiative, had demonstrated commercial potential that exceeded what a single company initiative could fully exploit. The applications were cross-industry. The right structure was not Sterling licensing the methodology to external parties, but a separate entity, jointly owned, that developed and deployed it with Sterling as both investor and anchor client. You'd be co-founder, she said. Equal ownership. He looked at her. Of what exactly? The company that doesn't exist yet. She said it simply. That we build. He sat with that for a moment. The word founder. He'd been a floor tech, then a senior tech, then a supervisor, then unemployed, then a contractor in a cold garage, then a team lead in a kitted-out facility. The word founder was not in that sequence, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. Why equal? He asked. Because the methodology is yours, she said. The resources are mine. Neither is sufficient without the other, and neither is more important than the other. Equal is accurate. Your board will have opinions about that. My board said yes. A pause. Harold Vance said yes first. He thought about Harold Vance writing something down for the first time in 12 years. He thought about the notebook in the kitchen drawer, about 6 motors in a storage room with buzzing lights. I'd want to talk to Renata before I respond formally, he said. Of course. And I'd want specific language about the training component. Sophia's expression shifted slightly. What training component? He'd been thinking about this since month 7. Since Joe's mistake and the conversation in the small office, and the specific texture of what it felt like to manage people towards something that wasn't fully defined yet. He'd been thinking about it in relation to something else too, something that had been in the back of his mind since the facility tour 14 months ago, when he'd looked at the people in that conference room and thought about who was there and who wasn't. Part of what we build, he said carefully, should include a training pathway for people who have the mechanical intuition and the hands-on background, but not the formal engineering credentials. The people who are where I was 3 years ago. Sophia was quiet. There are people like me in every industrial facility in the country, he said. Good mechanics, solid technicians, people with 12 years of practical experience who have been developing this kind of thinking informally their whole careers, but don't have the framework to articulate it or the credential to be taken seriously in rooms like this one. He paused. The methodology I built came from 32 years of being a human being and 12 years of hands-on work. If we systematize ALA without also creating a pathway for the people who produce that kind of thinking, we've built something that serves the industry but not the people in it. The office was quiet for a moment. Through the window behind Sophia's desk, the January light was flat and gray, and the parking lot below was half empty. That's a different kind of initiative, Sophia said. It has different cost structures and different timelines and different success metrics than the commercial methodology work. I know. It's also not what I was proposing. I know that too. He met her eyes. I'm not refusing the partnership. I'm telling you what I want it to include. She looked at him for a long moment, the particular focused stillness she brought to things she was taking seriously. Write it up, she said finally. What it would look like. How it would work. Bring it to Marcus first, then to me. Before or after Renata. Parallel, she said. Don't slow one down waiting for the other. He didn't slow either down. The partnership documents and the training program proposal developed simultaneously over the following 6 weeks, which meant Ethan was operating on 2 tracks at once in a way that required the kind of organizational discipline that did not come naturally to him, and which he managed partly by keeping very specific lists and partly by running each morning. He'd started running in month 10 because Dale had mentioned it offhandedly, and Ethan had realized that his body had been sending him signals for months that he'd been ignoring, and running was cheaper than the alternatives. The training program proposal went to Marcus on a Thursday. Marcus read it over the weekend and called Ethan Monday morning. The pilot cohort model is right, Marcus said. Don't try to build the full program first. Run 12 people through a structured pilot, evaluate what works, build from that. That's what I'd planned. I know. I'm confirming it. A pause. Where do you find the 12 people? Industry contacts. People I know from Hartwell and from the contract work. People who've reached out since the white paper. He paused. And a posting through the State Workforce Development Office. Because the people who reached out through existing networks are already somewhat networked. The people I want to reach aren't. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this for a while. Since month 7, Ethan said. Since a conversation I had with one of my engineers about a mistake he made. Joe? How did you know? Because Joe told me about it, Marcus said. He mentioned it when I checked in with the team in month 8. He said it was the most useful management conversation he'd ever had. I made a note. Ethan didn't say anything to that. I'll support this to Sophia, Marcus said. The commercial case is real. If ALA produces practitioners through a structured pathway, the methodology's deployment accelerates because you have people in the field who know how to use it. The social case doesn't need my help to make. The company was incorporated in month 14 as Adaptive Lifecycle Systems, LLC. Sophia's legal team had workshopped the name for 2 weeks and come back with 4 options, and Ethan had chosen the plainest one because it said what the company did. He and Sophia each held 45%. The remaining 10 was reserved for a future employee equity pool, which had been Sophia's idea and which Ethan had agreed to immediately. Ethan's title was co-founder and chief technical officer. He had looked at that on the incorporation documents for a while before signing. The pilot training cohort launched in month 16. 12 people, 9 men, 3 women, ages ranging from 26 to 51. 8 of them had industrial backgrounds similar to Ethan's. Years of hands-on work, strong mechanical intuition, no formal engineering credential. 3 had community college technical certificates. 1, a woman named Sandra who was 44 and had spent 18 years as a maintenance supervisor at a textile facility, had no technical credential of any kind, and had found the posting through the Workforce Development Office. Ethan ran the pilot himself, with Priya supporting on the technical instruction side. They met twice a week in the Northside facility, 3 hours per session, for 12 weeks. The curriculum was not a conventional engineering course. It was specifically designed to start from where these people already were, to take the practical knowledge they'd accumulated and give it the framework and language that made it transferable and legible to the broader industry. Sandra was his best student. He didn't say that out loud because you didn't rank students in a pilot cohort, but she was. She had the specific quality he'd noticed in himself and in the best mechanics he'd worked with over 12 years. The ability to listen to a machine, to let it tell you what it needed rather than projecting what you expected. She also asked the most difficult questions, which he appreciated more than he'd admitted. In week 6, she stopped him during a session. They were working through a case study based on the original 6-motor project, anonymized but recognizable to Ethan in every detail, and Sandra had been quiet for about 10 minutes, which was unusual for her. Can I ask something that's not about this case? She said. Yes. How did you know, she said, when you were in that situation, the one this case study is based on, how did you know it was going to work? Before you had proof. The room was quiet. The other 11 people were listening, he noticed. He thought about the honest answer, the really honest one, not the version that made a good story. I didn't, he said. I thought it might work. There's a difference. He paused. What I knew was that looking at something and deciding it was worthless was a choice, not a fact. And I'd rather be wrong about something having value than right about it being junk. Sandra nodded slowly. That's not an engineering principle, she said. No, he said. It's not. It's the thing underneath the engineering. The reason you'd bother to do the engineering in the first place. He looked at the room. That's actually what we're here to talk about. Not just the methodology. The question of why you'd ask the question differently than the person before you asked it. That session ran 45 minutes over time. Nobody left. The formal partnership announcement, press release, industry publication coverage, the whole apparatus, went out in month 17. Ethan did 2 interviews. He was not comfortable with interviews in the way that Sophia was comfortable with them. She had a decade of practice at translating complex technical and business ideas into language that read cleanly in print, and he did not. But he managed, with the specific discipline of someone who'd learned that discomfort was not a reason not to do something. One journalist, a woman who covered industrial technology for a trade publication, and who asked better questions than most of her counterparts, said to him near the end of the interview, "You started this from a contract to look at motors that everyone else had written off. Is there a version of this where you don't take that contract? Where you don't see what you saw in those motors?" He thought about it honestly. There's a version where I don't take the contract and those motors go to scrap. There's probably a version where someone else eventually asked the same question I asked. He paused. But I was the person who was there, looking at those motors, with the specific experience I had. Someone else might have asked a different question. This one came from me because of the specific accumulation of everything that got me to that storage room. Meaning your background as a mechanic. Meaning my background as a mechanic, yes. And as a father, and as a person who'd spent 14 months being told his experience wasn't what companies were looking for. A pause. Turns out that experience was exactly what was needed. It just didn't fit the credential system that decides what counts as experience. That quote ran in the piece. He didn't know it had run until Priya texted him a link with no message attached, and he read it on his phone at the facility and felt the odd, slightly vertiginous sensation of seeing something true about yourself written in a publication. The pilot cohort completed in month 17. All 12 participants finished. 8 of them, including Sandra, were already in conversations with industrial facilities about applying ALA methodology in their work environments. 2 were continuing their formal education, using the pilot certification as a stepping stone. 1 had been offered a position at Adaptive Lifecycle Systems directly, which was not something Ethan had planned for in the pilot design, and which required a budget conversation with Sophia that he'd been putting off. He had the budget conversation. Sophia said yes in less than 4 minutes. "You knew I was going to ask," he said. "I was waiting for you to ask," she said. "I didn't want to offer it before you did, because it needed to be your decision about who was right for the team." He looked at her across the desk in the office with the whiteboard. "You could have just offered it." "No," she said. "Some decisions belong to the person who has to live with them. I don't make those for other people." A pause. "I've made that mistake before." He thought he understood what she meant by that. He didn't ask her to elaborate. The event that concluded the first 18 months happened on a Saturday in late spring, which was not an event they had planned. It happened because Mia asked a question. She was 10 now. She'd had a birthday in month 15, which had been marked by a small party with 4 friends from school and a cake that Ethan had made from a box because he was a competent cook, but not a baker, and he had learned that the hard way twice. She was in 4th grade and had recently developed an interest in the mechanics of things, which he was careful not to make too much of because she was 10 and interests were for having, not for parenting toward an outcome. She came to the facility on a Saturday morning because Ethan had to go in, and she didn't have school, and there was no other arrangement. This had happened before, and she'd sat in the small office with her book and been fine. But this Saturday, she walked out of the office after about 40 minutes, and stood at the edge of the main floor looking at the test bays. "Can I see them?" she said. "See what?" She pointed at the far corner where, sitting on a fabricated display base that Daniel's team had built for a trade show demonstration, one of the original 6 motors was installed. Not rebuilt. One of the partially disassembled originals that Ethan had kept when the project completed, partly for reference and partly for a reason he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. The motor still showed its corrosion and its age. The housing was open on one side, revealing the internal components, some of them still in their degraded state, and some of them replaced with the rebuilt version so you could see both conditions side by side. He'd asked Sterling Technologies to keep it instead of scrapping it after the project. Sophia had looked at him when he asked and said, without elaborating, "Of course." He walked Mia over to it. She stood in front of it and looked at it with the particular quality of attention she'd had since she was very young. The stillness, the patience, the looking at something until you see it quality that he recognized because he had it himself and had never been sure whether she'd gotten it from him or whether it was just hers. "This is the one," she said. Not a question. One of them. There were 6. She reached out and touched the housing. Not the rusted part, the rebuilt side where the replaced components were installed, clean metal against the corroded original. She ran her finger along the seam between the 2 conditions. "It kept the bad part," she said. "We kept both. So you can see what it was and what it became." She was quiet for a moment. Why? He thought about how to answer that honestly, the way he'd learned to answer her honest questions. Because what it was is part of why it matters. If you just showed the rebuilt version, it would look like any other machine. The rust is what tells you that something was made from something people gave up on. She looked at the motor for another moment. Then she said, "Like the story I wrote, the one in 4th grade. He blinked. "You remember that?" "Miss Grace told you about it," Mia said, with the mild patience of someone correcting a factual error. "You came home that night and you thought I was asleep, but you weren't quiet enough." He had no response to that. "Engineers who look at broken things and see what they could become," she said. "That's what I wrote." She looked up at him. "Is that what happened? Is that what this is?" He looked at the motor. At the seam between what it had been and what it had become. At the rust and the clean metal, side by side, not hidden from each other, not one replacing the other, but both present in the same object. "Pretty much," he said. She nodded, satisfied, in the way she settled matters. They stayed another hour. She went back to her book, and he worked through the documentation he'd come in for, and when they left, he locked the facility and they drove home in the early afternoon light, with the radio on low and neither of them talking much, which was its own kind of conversation. There was a moment, on the highway, where he looked at her in the passenger seat. She'd moved to the front seat recently, another birthday milestone. And she was looking out the window with that still attention, watching the city go by. And he thought about the morning 14 months ago when he'd ironed a collar twice and driven to a facility tour with a 9-year-old toolbox and no reasonable expectation of what would come from it. He thought about the storage room, about 6 machines against a wall in the buzzing fluorescent light, about the specific moment of looking at something everyone had dismissed and thinking the question being asked might be the wrong question. He had not known, in that moment, what the right question would produce. He had not known about the garage or the notebooks or the funding or the partnership or the 12 people in a pilot cohort or Sandra asking a question that ran 45 minutes over time. He had not known about the white paper or Harold Vance writing something down or the trade publication piece or the company that now had 14 employees and a second facility in planning. He had known only that he was going to ask it. That was, he'd come to understand, the whole thing, not the results, which had been real and significant and which he was grateful for in a way that didn't have clean language. The results were real, but they were downstream. The source was the moment of deciding to ask the question that wasn't being asked, in the specific situation where everyone else had already concluded there was nothing left to find. The toolbox was in the back seat. He'd brought it to the facility that morning out of habit. He always brought it, the same way some people always brought a specific jacket or a specific pen, not because they needed it every day, but because it was part of how they operated. The latch still needed the exact angle. The handle had been re-welded once and would probably need it again in a year or two. 9 years of use showed on it in all the specific ways that use showed on things. He was not the same person who had ironed a collar twice and driven to a facility tour with low expectations. He was not fundamentally different either. He was the same person with more evidence about what he was capable of, which was a different thing than being a different person. Mia turned from the window. Dad? Yeah. Are you going to do the training program again? With more people? Yes, the next cohort starts in September. She looked at him with an expression he'd seen on her face recently more often, something more evaluative, less purely childlike, the first signs of the person she was going to be. Can I come watch one time? He glanced at her. Why? Because I want to see what it looks like, she said, when people learn to look at things differently. He kept his eyes on the road. The city was behind them now, the highway opening up toward the neighborhood where they lived, where the apartment with the cracked ceiling was waiting. The landlord still delinquent on repairs that Ethan still fixed himself because some things you fixed yourself. The new lease rate. The radiator on one setting. The patch above the window that held because he'd done it right the second time. Some things had changed, some things hadn't and probably wouldn't. Life didn't resolve into clean symmetry just because a story had gotten good. You still ran out of cereal. The lights in the hallway still flickered on cold mornings. The dishes were always there, and the work was still there, which was also true, and which was a different thing than a burden, more like the evidence that what you'd built was real enough to need maintaining. September, he said to Mia. You can come one session in September. Which session? He thought about it. The first one. So you see how it starts. She nodded, turned back to the window. After a minute, she said, I think I want to be an engineer. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you've got time to figure that out. I know, I'm just saying. I heard you. She smiled at the window. He drove. The city moved past them. The industrial corridor with its loading docks and weathered facades. The neighborhoods with their ordinary Saturday afternoon life. The stretch of highway where you could see, briefly, the glass front of Sterling Technologies' main building catching the afternoon sun. Mia didn't point it out this time. She'd seen it enough by now. What Ethan remembered later about that particular drive was not any single thing that was said or seen. It was the quality of the afternoon, ordinary and specific and unremarkable in the way that the best moments often are, the ones that don't announce themselves. A father and his daughter on a highway in spring. A toolbox in the back seat. Work that had been done and work that remained, and the ordinary fact of knowing the difference. The 6 motors, or what remained of them, were distributed now across 3 locations. The rebuilt system that had started the whole thing lived in Sterling Technologies' demonstration center, operational and in use. The white paper cited them by technical designation. The one on the display base in the north side facility held its 2 conditions side by side, rust and clean metal, what it had been and what it had become. Not a monument, just a machine, doing what machines do best when someone takes the time to ask the right question, showing you what was possible all along, if you were willing to look. Ethan took the exit for home. The apartment was 5 minutes out. You hungry? He asked. Starving, Mia said, in the tone of someone for whom this was an emergency. We'll figure something out. That's what you always say. And we always do. She didn't have an argument for that. Neither did he. He pulled into their street and found a parking spot 2 buildings down, which counted as luck on a Saturday. And they got out and he locked the car, and she was already at the building door with her key out. And the afternoon was warm, and the light was the particular gold of late spring, and somewhere in the building someone was cooking something that smelled like onions and olive oil. And he stood on the sidewalk for just a moment before following her in, not marking the moment, just being in it. Then he went inside, and they figured something out for dinner, and the day ended the way most days ended, imperfectly and specifically, and with enough to carry forward into the next one. That was the whole of it. That was enough.